The storm should have killed him. Instead, it trapped him inside with killers. High Divide. A Western Thriller. Chapter 1. Keep your footing, Eldridge Sample told the bay horse. Ice coated the animal's mane, turning the black hair into stiff white needles. The wind howled down the mountain pass, carrying a blinding sheet of snow. The temperature plummeted with every step, turning the air into razor blades against exposed skin. Eldridge leaned forward in the saddle. He pressed his face into the rough wool of his scarf. He let the horse find the path. Animals possess better instincts for survival in the whiteout. A shadow materialized out of the driving snow. Solid angles. A roof line. Summit Station sat perched on the spine of the Continental Divide. It functioned as a coaling stop and a refuge for the narrow-gauge line. A structure built from raw granite and heavy timber, designed to withstand the brutal temper of the high country. Eldridge steered the bay toward the attached stable. The open bay offered protection from the wind. He dismounted. His boots hit the packed snow with a dull crunch. His knees ached from the cold. He led the horse into an empty stall, unbuckled the frozen cinch, and pulled the heavy western saddle from the animal's back. He found a half-empty oat bag hanging on a nail. He emptied it into the trough. "Eat," Eldridge said. "We hold our position tonight." He left the stable. He waded through thigh-deep drifts to reach the main entrance of the depot. He gripped the heavy iron handle of the oak door. He leaned his entire weight backward, fighting the vacuum of the storm. The door cracked open. He squeezed through the gap and pushed the heavy wood shut, throwing the iron deadbolt. The wind noise dropped to a muffled roar. The main room of Summit Station smelled of burning coal, wet wool, and stale tobacco. A massive cast-iron potbelly stove dominated the center of the room. Its belly glowed a dull, angry cherry red. 5 kerosene lamps hung from the ceiling beams, casting harsh yellow light against the log walls. Frost encrusted the interior of the glass windows, sealing the room off from the outside world. Eldridge stood near the door. He stomped his boots on the floorboards, knocking chunks of packed snow from his heels. He unbuttoned his canvas coat. He kept the coat on, but he ensured the flap rested behind the walnut grips of his Colt Peacemaker. He walked toward a wooden counter set into the far wall. A wire cage protected the man sitting behind it. The station master wore a green visor and a thick wool sweater. He tallied numbers in a ledger book. "The line is dead," the station master announced. He did not look up. "Telegraph wires snapped an hour ago. The pass is closed. The next train arrives when the rotary plow digs through the drifts. Tomorrow. Maybe the day after." "I require a room," Eldridge said. "And coffee. Black." The station master closed the ledger. He stood up. He inspected the new arrival. He noted the canvas coat, the snow melting on the hat brim, and the low-slung gun belt. "Rooms cost $2 a night," the station master said. "Pay in ad Miller. Coffee costs a nickel. I offer 0 refunds if you freeze." Eldridge reached into his vest pocket. He produced 2 silver dollars and a nickel. He slid the coins under the wire grate. The station master took the money. He handed a brass key through the gap. "Room 4. Top of the stairs. First door." The station master retrieved a tin cup from a shelf. He poured thick black liquid from a scorched pot sitting on a side stove. He slid the cup through the grate. Eldridge took the cup. The heat burned through the tin, warming his frozen fingers. He walked away from the counter. He approached the red-hot potbelly stove. He found an empty wooden chair facing the iron heater. He sat down. He rested the cup on his knee. He let the heat thaw the ice in his bones. He took a sip of the coffee. It tasted like battery acid and burnt chicory. He drank it anyway. He needed the heat. He turned his attention from the stove to the room. A locked room full of strangers requires a physical assessment. Eldridge evaluated the geometry of the space and the people occupying it. A traveling salesman snored on a wooden bench near the ticket window. He clutched a leather sample case against his chest like a shield. A pair of off-duty railway brakemen sat at a small table, playing a silent game of cribbage. They drank whiskey from a shared flask. They looked exhausted. One other passenger occupied the room. She sat in a high-backed armchair, positioned in the darkest corner, away from the stove and the windows. Eldridge studied her over the rim of his tin cup. She wore a dark blue wool traveling suit, practical and expensive. A matching hat sat pinned to her dark hair. A heavy woolen blanket rested across her lap. She kept her hands buried under the blanket. She did not read. She did not sleep. She projected the coiled tension of a mainspring wound tight. Eldridge watched her movements. They lacked the idle fidgeting of a bored traveler. Her eyes scanned the room, lingering on the deadbolt of the front door, tracking the station master's trips to the back room, measuring the distance to the stairwell. She evaluated the exits. People who evaluate exits anticipate trouble. She brought her right hand out from under the blanket. She held a silver pocket watch. Her thumb pressed the catch. The silver lid popped open with a sharp, metallic click. The sound cut through the crackle of the burning coal. She stared at the dial. She snapped the lid shut. Click. She returned her hand to the warmth of the blanket. Eldridge took another sip of the bitter coffee. He counted the seconds in his head. He watched the fire through the grate of the stove. 2 minutes passed. The woman brought her hand out again. She pressed the catch. Click. She checked the time. She closed the case. Click. She repeated the action 4 times in 10 minutes. Eldridge set his tin cup on the floorboards. He recognized the pattern. She expected an arrival. A train running on a schedule. Or a person running on a deadline. The dead telegraph lines and the raging blizzard had shattered the schedule. The broken timetable caused her distress. She possessed the look of a woman who carried secrets of high value. High value attracts desperate men. The wind screamed against the heavy log walls of the depot, rattling the frosted glass in the window frames. The building shuddered under the force of the gale. The snow piled higher against the door, burying the entrance. Eldridge leaned back in the wooden chair. He stretched his legs toward the stove. He kept his eyes on the woman in the corner. He kept his right hand resting loose on his thigh. He came to the high country seeking a quiet night and a warm fire. The fire provided heat, but the quiet felt fragile. The ticking of the silver pocket watch counted down the minutes to an inevitable disruption. Eldridge closed his eyes, listening to the storm, waiting for the front door to burst open. Chapter 2. A massive impact hammered the heavy oak door. The iron deadbolt groaned against the strike plate. A second strike followed, heavier than the first. The wood framing the lock shattered. The door blew inward, riding a violent gale of white snow and freezing air that instantly killed the heat in the room. 7 figures stepped through the breach. They wore thick buffalo hide coats and wool scarves pulled up to their eyes. Ice crusted their hat brims. They moved with a synchronized, practiced rhythm, hauling heavy loads. 6 of the men dragged thick canvas sacks behind them. The sacks hit the pine floorboards with a dense, grinding crunch. The sound indicated raw, unrefined rock. Heavy silver ore. The lead man turned and forced the heavy oak door shut against the howling wind. He dropped a thick timber beam across the iron brackets on the doorframe, sealing the depot from the storm. He pulled the wool scarf down from his face. He possessed a neat, trimmed beard streaked with gray. Wire-rimmed spectacles sat perched on his nose, the lenses fogging in the sudden warmth of the room. He brushed the snow from the sleeves of his expensive coat. He carried a double-barreled Greener shotgun. He broke the action open, inspected the brass bases of the 2 shells sitting in the chambers, and snapped the weapon closed. The metallic clack cut through the hiss of the potbelly stove. "Good evening," the man announced. He projected a warm, cultured baritone, the voice of a university lecturer addressing a hall of students. "The weather presents a severe hazard tonight. We require the fire." The 6 men behind him dropped their canvas sacks. They fanned out across the room. They executed the maneuver with absolute military discipline. 2 men secured the back hallway leading to the kitchen. 2 men flanked the front door. 2 men moved toward the wire cage of the ticket counter. They carried Winchester repeating rifles and heavy Army-issue revolvers. Eldridge Sample remained seated in his wooden chair. He did not flinch. He did not reach for the Colt Peacemaker on his hip. He brought the tin cup to his lips. He took a sip of the bitter, black coffee. He calculated the geometry of the room. 7 targets. The men holding the rifles controlled the long sightlines. The men with the revolvers controlled the close quarters near the desk. The potbelly stove offered cast-iron cover, but it sat dead center in an overlapping field of fire. Engaging them meant fighting a coordinated unit from a seated disadvantage. He kept his right hand flat on his thigh. He chose observation over suicide. The station master stood up behind the wire grate. He clutched his ledger book to his chest. "You broke my door lock," the station master said. His voice trembled, betraying the false bravado. "You intend to pay for that wood." The bearded man smiled. He reached into his coat pocket. He retrieved a silver dollar. He flicked the coin through the gap in the wire cage. It struck the ledger book and dropped to the counter. "For the wood," the man said. He raised the Greener shotgun, pointing the twin black bores at the station master's chest. "Step away from the telegraph key," the man instructed. "Unlock the wire door. Step out of the cage." The station master looked at the shotgun. He looked at the silver dollar. He abandoned the cage, unlocking the side door and stepping out into the main room with his hands raised shoulder high. The bearded man swept his gaze across the room. He catalogued the traveling salesman cowering on the bench. He noted the 2 brakemen sitting rigid at their cribbage game. His eyes passed over Eldridge and settled on the woman in the dark corner. "Ladies and gentlemen," the man said, "my name is Silas Miller. We prefer the title Professor. My associates and I experienced a delay in our transit schedule. We commandeer this facility for the duration of the storm." The salesman whimpered, clutching his leather sample case tight against his face. "I guarantee your safety under one condition," Miller continued. "You offer 0 resistance. You sit quiet. You live to see the rotary snowplow clear the tracks tomorrow morning. You demonstrate heroics. You freeze in the snowdrifts outside. The choice belongs entirely to you." One of the off-duty brakemen shifted his weight. He dropped his right hand below the edge of the card table, reaching toward his boot. A heavy-set man standing near the stove tracked the movement. The enforcer wore a bearskin coat that made him look like a grizzly standing on its hind legs. He crossed the floor in 2 massive strides. The enforcer did not speak. He drove the steel butt plate of his Winchester rifle directly into the side of the brakeman's jaw. Bone cracked. The impact lifted the brakeman out of his chair. He crashed to the floorboards, spitting blood and teeth, and lay motionless. The second brakeman raised his hands high, pressing his back against the log wall. "Hollis prefers absolute stillness," Miller explained, gesturing toward the giant enforcer. "I suggest you accommodate his preference. He lacks my patience for negotiation." Eldridge watched Hollis step back and rest the rifle on his hip. Hollis breathed through his mouth, his eyes scanning the room for another excuse to swing the heavy wood stock. Eldridge shifted his eyes back to Silas Miller. Miller walked to the nearest canvas sack. He kicked it with the toe of his polished boot. The silver ore ground together inside the fabric. "Secure the perimeter," Miller ordered his men. "Check the back rooms. Drag the bodies into a pile if you find anyone hiding. We hold the station until the morning train arrives. We load the cargo and we depart." Eldridge took another sip of his coffee. The cup felt cold now. He glanced toward the dark corner of the room. The woman in the blue traveling suit sat perfectly still. The silver pocket watch remained hidden. Her right hand rested out of sight beneath the heavy wool blanket draped across her lap. Eldridge saw the tension in her shoulder. He read the tightening of her jaw. She prepared to violate Miller's rule. She prepared to demonstrate heroics against a 7-man crew holding the high ground. Eldridge recognized a fatal miscalculation taking shape, and he tightened his grip on his tin cup, waiting for the gunfire to erupt. Chapter 3. "The schedule dictates our reality," Silas Miller told the room. He stood near the potbelly stove, soaking up the heat. He kept the double-barreled greener rested in the crook of his left arm. He exuded the relaxed confidence of a man holding a winning lottery ticket. "The rotary snowplow departs Denver at midnight," Miller continued. "It carves a path through the drifts. It reaches Summit Station by mid-morning. We simply require a warm place to wait for our transportation." The traveling salesman on the bench let out a high, thin whine. He squeezed his eyes shut. He pressed his leather sample case tight against his face, trying to block out the armed men occupying the depot. Miller ignored the salesman. He turned his head. He looked at the woman sitting in the dark corner. "You disagree with my timetable, miss?" Miller asked. Dora Reed sat rigid in the high-backed armchair. She had stopped checking her silver pocket watch. She kept both hands hidden beneath the heavy woolen blanket draped across her lap. She stared at the man with the gray-streaked beard and the wire-rimmed spectacles. She studied the cut of his expensive coat. She recognized the precise, cultured baritone of his voice. "I recognize your face, Silas," Dora stated. Her voice cut through the hiss of the burning coal. It held zero tremor. It projected absolute certainty. Miller tilted his head. He peered at her through the fogged lenses of his spectacles. He took a step closer, leaving the immediate radius of the stove. "You possess an advantage," Miller said. "You know my name. I find myself at a disadvantage regarding yours." "You robbed the Union Pacific Express car outside Cheyenne," Dora said. 3 months ago. You utilized a precision explosive charge on the vault door. You left 0 casualties. You took $60,000 in minted silver. The 6 men fanning out across the room shifted their weight. The heavy-set enforcer, Hollis, took a half-step toward the corner. He lowered the muzzle of his Winchester rifle. He looked at Miller, awaiting an order. Miller raised 2 fingers of his right hand. A silent command to hold position. "A popular myth," Miller said. He offered a modest smile. "The newspapers exaggerate my exploits. They build a legend out of basic structural engineering." "They issued a federal warrant," Dora replied. "They printed your photograph on heavy stock paper. They circulated it to every detective agency between Chicago and San Francisco." Miller stopped smiling. The cultured mask slipped, revealing the cold, calculating intelligence underneath. He recognized the tone of her voice. He recognized the posture. She lacked the panic of the salesman. She lacked the resignation of the brakeman. She displayed the clinical detachment of a professional investigator. You work for Alan Pinkerton, Miller deduced. I carry the commission, Dora confirmed. Eldridge Sample sat motionless in his wooden chair. He kept his eyes on Dora. He read the tension radiating from her shoulders. He saw the slight shift in her posture under the heavy wool blanket. She prepared to make a move. She calculated the odds poorly. A lone detective facing 7 armed men in a confined space requires deception. She requires patience. She needs to wait for the men to separate, or sleep, or drop their guard. Dora Reed chose confrontation. She believed the element of surprise compensated for the deficit in firepower. She banked on her speed. She threw the wool blanket aside. The fabric sailed through the air. She brought her right hand up. She gripped a short-barreled .38 caliber Smith & Wesson revolver, a weapon designed for close quarters and fast draws. She aimed the snub-nosed barrel directly at the center of Silas Miller's chest. She intended to end the standoff by removing the commander. She committed a fatal tactical error. She ignored the perimeter. Miller did not attempt to raise his double-barreled shotgun. He stood perfectly still. He allowed his men to perform the labor he paid them to execute. Hollis reacted with the brutal efficiency of a coiled spring snapping loose. The giant enforcer did not bother aiming down the sights. He fired the Winchester from the hip. Boom! The heavy rifle report detonated inside the sealed room. The sound hit the eardrums like a physical blow. A cloud of acrid white smoke erupted from the muzzle, instantly filling the space between the stove and the ticket counter. The .44 caliber slug crossed the room. It struck Dora Reed high on the right side of her chest. The kinetic shock lifted her out of the armchair. The bullet shattered her collarbone and tore through the muscle of her shoulder. She slammed against the log wall behind the chair. She slid down the rough bark, hitting the pine floorboards with a heavy thud. The Smith & Wesson slipped from her fingers. It clattered against the wood, spinning out of her reach. Blood blossomed on the dark blue fabric of her traveling suit. It spread fast, a dark wet stain soaking the wool. She gasped, a ragged wet sound. She clutched her shattered shoulder with her left hand. Shock drained the color from her face, turning her skin the color of old parchment. The traveling salesman screamed. He dropped his leather case. He threw himself flat on the floor, covering his head with his arms. Eldridge Sample did not flinch. He kept his right hand flat on his right thigh. He did not let his fingers twitch toward the Colt peacemaker. He breathed slow, measured breaths. He evaluated the aftermath of the violence. He noted Hollis's reaction time. The giant moved fast for a man his size. He fired with lethal accuracy under pressure. Eldridge logged the information for future reference. He caught Silas Miller's eye. Miller looked across the room. He stared directly at the drifter sitting in the chair by the stove. Miller saw the absolute lack of panic. He saw a man who treated a gunshot like a change in the weather. Miller nodded. A small, almost imperceptible gesture of acknowledgement. A recognition of a fellow professional who understood the mathematics of survival. Eldridge held the gaze. He offered zero response. Miller broke eye contact. He turned his attention back to the bleeding woman in the corner. He walked over to Dora. He looked down at her. He used the toe of his polished boot to kick the fallen Smith & Wesson across the floorboards. The gun slid under the ticket counter, out of play. A profound miscalculation, Detective, Miller stated. Dora gritted her teeth. She squeezed her eyes shut, fighting the wave of agony radiating from her collarbone. She refused to scream. She pulled a shallow breath through her nose. "You hang for this, Silas," Dora whispered. "I hang for nothing," Miller corrected. I possess a precise exit strategy. You provided an unnecessary complication. Miller turned to his men. The air in the depot smelled of burnt powder, wet wool, and fresh blood. The hiss of the potbelly stove filled the silence. Hollis, Miller ordered. Secure the room. Strip the weapons from the brakemen. Check the drifter. Hollis stepped forward. He racked the lever of the Winchester. A smoking brass casing ejected from the breech, hitting the floor with a metallic clink. He chambered a live round. He aimed the rifle at Eldridge's chest. Stand up, Hollis demanded. Eldridge stood. He kept his hands visible, held at waist height. He did not make sudden movements. He let the enforcer dictate the pace. Hollis approached. He jammed the cold muzzle of the rifle against Eldridge's sternum. He reached out with his massive left hand. He unbuckled the gun belt hanging on Eldridge's hip. He pulled the heavy rig free, taking the Colt Peacemaker and 40 rounds of ammunition. He tossed the belt onto the ticket counter. Check his pockets, Miller instructed from across the room. Hollis patted Eldridge down. He checked the canvas coat. He checked the vest. He checked the boots. He found 0 backup weapons. Eldridge favored a single, reliable tool. Hollis stepped back. He grunted his satisfaction. Miller surveyed his captured audience. He looked at the bleeding detective, the terrified salesman, the resigned brakeman, and the empty-handed drifter. He established total dominance over the environment. Gather them, Miller told his crew. We require a secure holding area. I dislike an audience while I conduct my business. The men with the revolvers stepped forward, ready to herd the prisoners. Eldridge kept his face blank. He surrendered his weapon, but he retained his geometry. He calculated the distance to the front door, the distance to the stove, and the structural integrity of the walls. He waited for the next shift in the board. Chapter 4. Clear the parlor, Silas Miller ordered. The cultured baritone voice echoed in the ringing silence following the gunshot. The scent of burnt powder hung heavy, a bitter cloud settling over the waiting room. Miller adjusted his wire-rimmed spectacles. He stepped away from the pooling blood spreading across the pine floorboards. He pointed a gloved finger toward the heavy iron-strapped door on the north wall. The stenciled letters on the wood read baggage. Herding livestock requires a firm hand, Hollis, Miller told the giant enforcer. Move them. We require the space for our own preparations. Hollis grunted. He kept the smoking Winchester leveled at Eldridge Sample's chest. The giant jerked his head toward the north wall. Walk, Hollis commanded. Eldridge remained planted in his boots. He looked at Dora Reed. The Pinkerton detective lay slumped against the log wall, her right shoulder a ruined mass of torn wool and shattered bone. Blood leaked through her fingers, painting her hand a slick bright crimson. Shock glazed her eyes. She tried to push herself up with her left arm. Her elbow collapsed. She hit the floorboards hard. Bone ground against bone. She swallowed a scream, biting her bottom lip until it bled. Hollis stepped forward. He raised the steel-shod butt of the rifle, intending to strike the woman to motivate her compliance. She lacks the leverage to stand, Eldridge stated. The flat tone stopped Hollis mid-stride. You hit her, she loses consciousness. You drag a dead weight, you waste energy. I will carry her. Hollis tightened his grip on the Winchester. He looked at Miller for a ruling. Miller evaluated the drifter. He noted the absolute lack of panic. He nodded. A practical solution. Proceed, Mr. Sample. But maintain a slow pace. Hollis possesses a nervous trigger finger. Eldridge crouched beside Dora. He smelled the iron tang of her blood, mixed with the lavender soap she used. He slid his left arm under her knees. He slid his right arm behind her uninjured shoulder. "Brace yourself," Eldridge whispered. He stood up in one smooth, continuous motion. Dora let out a sharp hiss. Her head fell against his canvas coat. She weighed very little, her frame slight and bird-like under the heavy traveling suit. She squeezed her eyes shut, fighting the wave of agony radiating from her collarbone. "I possess my own 2 feet," Dora breathed against his collar. "Keep them off the floor," Eldridge replied. "Pride slows us down." Eldridge turned toward the north door. The rest of Miller's crew sprang into motion. 2 men grabbed the station master by the collar of his thick wool sweater. They hauled him out from behind the wire grate, throwing him toward the center of the room. The station master stumbled, his ledger book dropping to the floor. Another armed man kicked open the swinging door leading to the depot's kitchen. He emerged seconds later, dragging a man wearing a grease-stained apron. The cook held a cast-iron skillet raised above his head. "Drop the iron," the gunman ordered. He jammed the barrel of a Colt Army revolver into the cook's ribs. The cook dropped the skillet. It struck the floor with a heavy clang. He raised flour-dusted hands in the air, his eyes wide with absolute terror. The traveling salesman remained on the floor, curled in a fetal position with his arms wrapped over his head. He sobbed, a high continuous whimper. Hollis walked over to the salesman. He planted his heavy boot on the man's leather sample case. He delivered a swift, brutal kick to the salesman's thigh. "Up," Hollis barked. The salesman scrambled to his feet. He abandoned his leather case. He joined the huddle of prisoners, forming in the center of the depot. The 2 off-duty brakemen stood shoulder to shoulder, their faces pale, their hands raised waist-high. "Open the door," Miller instructed one of his men. A man in a buffalo hide coat grabbed the heavy iron latch of the baggage room door. He threw his weight backward. The heavy timber panel swung outward. A blast of sub-zero air rushed into the heated depot. The baggage room lacked a stove. It lacked insulation. The room functioned as a meat locker, built directly against the exterior stone foundation of the station. The temperature drop hit the prisoners like a physical blow. Their breath instantly turned to white plumes in the sudden freeze. "Inside," Hollis ordered. He waved the Winchester. The station master entered first, shivering in his sweater. The cook followed, rubbing his arms. The brakemen marched in without protest. The salesman hesitated at the threshold, feeling the bitter cold. Hollis shoved him hard between the shoulder blades. The salesman stumbled into the dark. Eldridge approached the doorway, carrying Dora. He stopped at the threshold. He cataloged the construction of the door. Solid oak planks 3 inches thick. 4 horizontal iron straps secured the wood. Heavy iron hinges bolted directly into the stone framing. The locking mechanism sat on the outside. A massive sliding iron bolt designed to secure valuable freight against thieves. Breaking the door from the inside required explosives or days of labor with heavy steel tools. They possessed neither. He stepped into the freezing dark. The baggage room smelled of wet canvas, coal dust, and old leather trunks. Shadows swallowed the corners. The space lacked external windows. Zero natural light penetrated the thick walls. A single ventilation grate sat set high in the far wall, a tiny square of iron bars measuring 6 inches across. The raging blizzard outside forced snow through the grate, creating a small white drift on the floorboards below. Eldridge moved to a stack of empty canvas mail sacks piled near the wall. He lowered Dora gently onto the canvas. "Keep your hand pressed against the wound," Eldridge instructed her. "Maintain the pressure." Dora obeyed. She clamped her left hand over her shattered right shoulder. Her teeth chattered. The cold began to drain the remaining heat from her body. Eldridge turned around. He faced the open doorway. Silas Miller stood in the light of the depot, framed by the heavy oak jambs. Hollis stood behind him, the rifle ready. The heat of the main room rolled over Miller's shoulders, a stark contrast to the icebox holding the prisoners. "Make yourselves comfortable," Miller said. The cultured voice echoed against the bare walls of the baggage room. "The accommodations lack luxury, but they provide absolute security." "We freeze to death in here," the station master shouted. He wrapped his arms around his chest. "The temperature drops 20 degrees below zero tonight. We hold 0 blankets." "A minor discomfort," Miller replied. He offered a slight, sympathetic smile that contained 0 actual warmth. "Your survival depends entirely on your capacity to share body heat. I suggest you huddle close together." Miller turned his head. He addressed his crew of armed men. He spoke loud enough for the prisoners to hear the entire tactical plan. "Secure the windows," Miller commanded his men. "Drag the heavy benches across the doors. We establish a perimeter." "The telegraph is dead, Professor," the man in the buffalo coat said. "The pass sits buried under 10 feet of snow. Nobody rides up this mountain tonight." "Never rely on the weather," Miller instructed. "We rely on preparation. We hold this station until dawn." The rotary snowplow departed Denver precisely on schedule. It carves a path through the drifts. The heavy steam engine pushes the rotary blades. It clears the track up the mountain. It reaches Summit Station by mid-morning. Miller looked back into the dark baggage room. He focused his gaze on Eldridge. "The snowplow train brings a cleared track," Miller explained. "It brings our exit route. We secure the cargo from the express car, we load our silver ore, and we ride the cleared rails down the western slope. A perfect, seamless transit." "You require a key," Dora whispered from the canvas sacks. Her voice trembled from the cold and the shock. Miller tilted his head. He peered into the gloom. "I possess the knowledge, Detective," Miller said. "I possess the time. The key simplifies the operation, but dynamite solves all locked doors eventually. We simply wait for our transportation to arrive." Miller grabbed the heavy iron handle on the outside of the door. "Conserve your breath, ladies and gentlemen," Miller advised. "The morning brings a resolution." He pulled the heavy oak door shut. The thick timber silenced the crackle of the potbelly stove and the voices of the armed men in the depot. The heavy iron bolt slid home with a loud, final scrape of metal against metal. Absolute blackness consumed the baggage room. The cold rushed in to fill the void left by the light. The wind screamed outside the thick stone walls, a relentless, high-pitched howl promising a long, brutal night. Eldridge Sample stood in the dark. He listened to the breathing of the terrified men around him. He felt the temperature dropping against his skin. He touched the heavy brass handle of the Bowie knife sheathed on his belt. He calculated the odds of surviving the freeze. He calculated the odds of breaking the iron. Chapter 5. Eldridge Sample unbuckled his heavy canvas coat. The temperature inside the baggage room hovered around 0, but the exertion of carrying the wounded woman generated body heat. He needed flexibility more than insulation right now. He knelt beside Dora Reed. The Pinkerton detective lay on the stack of canvas mail sacks, shivering violently. Her teeth chattered, a rapid clicking sound in the absolute dark. The smell of fresh blood dominated the small space, cutting through the scent of wet canvas and coal dust. "Move your hand," Eldridge ordered softly. Dora hesitated. Her left hand remained clamped over her shattered right shoulder. The shock of the .44 caliber impact still dictated her nervous system's response. "Move it," Eldridge repeated. He placed his own hand over hers. His grip felt warm compared to her freezing skin. "I need to assess the damage. If you bleed out, we lose our advantage." Dora let out a shaky breath. She relaxed her fingers. Eldridge probed the wound in the pitch blackness. He relied entirely on touch. His fingers traced the jagged tear in the heavy wool fabric of her traveling suit. He felt the hot, slick flow of blood. He pressed deeper, locating the entry wound below the collarbone. He felt the sharp edges of pulverized bone and torn muscle. He felt for an exit wound on her back. He found none. The heavy lead slug remained lodged in the tissue. "The bullet stopped," Eldridge said. "The bone caught it. It missed the lung. You keep breathing, you survived the initial trauma." "It feels like fire," Dora breathed through clenched teeth. "It feels like shock," Eldridge corrected. "The cold slows the bleeding. It helps us." Eldridge reached down to the hem of Dora's wool skirt. He grasped the thick fabric with both hands. He pulled hard. The material tore. He ripped a long, wide strip from the skirt. He folded the wool into a thick pad. "Press this against the hole," Eldridge instructed. He guided her left hand, placing the wool pad directly over the wound. "Apply firm pressure. Keep it steady. Do not let up." "I understand," Dora whispered. Eldridge stood up. He turned his attention to the other prisoners, huddled in the freezing dark. The cook, the station master, and the two brakemen crouched together near the far wall. They murmured low, frantic prayers. The traveling salesman sat apart, weeping into his hands, a continuous sound of broken resolve. "Quiet," Eldridge commanded. The flat authority in his voice cut through the panic. The murmurs ceased. The salesman choked off a sob. "You waste energy shivering in separate corners," Eldridge told them. "You lose heat to the air. Group together. Sit shoulder to shoulder. Place the salesman in the center. Use your combined body mass. Huddle." The men hesitated. Then the instinct for survival kicked in. They crawled together, forming a tight knot of bodies on the cold floorboards. They pulled the whimpering salesman into the middle of the pack. Eldridge walked to the heavy oak door. He placed his ear against the thick timber. He listened to the muffled sounds of Silas Miller and his crew occupying the depot. He heard the heavy scrape of benches moving across the floorboards. He heard the metallic clack of rifles being loaded. He heard Miller issuing calm, precise orders. Eldridge stepped back from the door. He analyzed the tactical situation. He organized the data points he had collected since walking into Summit Station. "Miller intends to utilize the rotary snowplow train," Eldridge stated to the dark room. He directed his words toward Dora. "He requires transportation down the mountain. The blizzard grounds all horses. The train provides the only exit." "He robbed the express car," Dora whispered from the mail sacks. Her voice sounded weaker now, fighting the pain and the cold. "He hit the Union Pacific line yesterday afternoon. Further down the slope. He utilized dynamite." "He carried canvas sacks into the depot," Eldridge recalled. "Raw silver ore," Dora confirmed. $60,000 in minted bars. He transported it here. To the summit. He intends to load it onto the westbound train. He waits for the rotary plow to clear the tracks, Eldridge deduced. He secures his cargo. He commandeers the engine. He rides the cleared rails down the western slope. A clean getaway. "He requires a key," Dora said. Eldridge heard the rustle of fabric. He heard a soft metallic clink. "The express car on the westbound train carries a federal payroll," Dora explained. Her breath hitched. "The vault requires a master brass key. The railroad entrusted the key to the Pinkerton Agency for Transit." "You carry the key," Eldridge stated. "I carry the key," Dora confirmed. The pieces locked into place. The geometry of the crime revealed itself. Miller executed a two-part operation. He secured the silver ore first. He retreated to the summit. He waited for the specific train carrying the payroll to arrive, intending to double his profit before escaping. Miller possesses zero patience for locked doors, Eldridge said. He told you dynamite solves all problems. Dynamite damages currency, Dora argued. It burns the greenbacks. It melts the silver. He prefers the key. It preserves the assets. He searches you, Eldridge said. He realizes you lack the key. He realizes you hid it. I secured it, Dora said. Where? A safe location. Within this depot. Eldridge ran his hand over his jaw. He considered the timeline. The rotary snowplow arrives at dawn. Miller holds the depot until the train pulls into the station. He secures the engine. He secures the express car. He demands the key from the detective. Miller leaves zero witnesses, Eldridge concluded. The logic remained absolute. He promised we survive if we stay quiet, the station master whimpered from the huddle of men. He lied, Eldridge said bluntly. He possesses the intellect of an academic, but he executes operations like a butcher. He holds 7 armed men. We represent a liability. We identify his face. We testify in federal court. He holds zero reason to let us live. He locked us in an icebox, the cook pointed out. We freeze before dawn. The cold serves as a convenience, Eldridge said. But he relies on absolute certainty. Once the train arrives, once he secures his escape route and demands the key from the detective, he finishes the job. He shoots us, the salesman cried out. He burns us, Eldridge said. The absolute finality of the statement silenced the room. He barricaded the doors, Eldridge explained. He secured the windows. He controls the perimeter. When the train arrives, he sets a fire in the main depot. He boards the engine. He departs. The building burns to the foundation. We burn with it. The fire destroys the evidence. The fire destroys the witnesses. He blames the destruction on an accidental stove fire caused by the blizzard. Dora groaned on the canvas sacks. A perfect, seamless transit. We require an exit, Eldridge stated. He turned away from the heavy oak door. Breaking the iron bolt required explosives. They possessed zero explosives. He walked to the far wall of the baggage room. He reached up. He felt the cold iron bars of the single ventilation grate, set high near the ceiling. Snow blew through the 6-inch square opening, stinging his face. The opening proved too small for a human body to squeeze through. Eldridge knelt on the floorboards. He felt the construction of the room. The baggage area lacked insulation. It sat directly on the foundation timbers. He drew the heavy Bowie knife from the sheath on his belt. The brass handle felt cold in his palm. He moved his hands across the rough pine floorboards. He searched for seams. He searched for imperfections in the carpentry. He searched for a flaw in Miller's perfect trap. Chapter 6. Eldridge wedged the heavy steel blade of the Bowie knife into the narrow seam between the cast-iron floor grate and the pine floorboards. He applied downward pressure on the brass handle. The thick steel flexed. The wood groaned, a low protesting creak in the pitch-black baggage room. A rusted iron rivet held the corner of the grate tight to the joist. Eldridge needed to shear the rivet head or pull the shaft straight out of the old timber. "What are you doing?" the station master hissed. His teeth chattered, chopping the words into pieces. "I prefer an alternate exit," Eldridge said. He shifted his grip. His fingers felt stiff, numb from the sub-freezing air. He pressed his left palm flat against the back of the blade, driving the wedge deeper. "That metal binds solid," the station master said. The railroad built this depot to hold freight. You lack the tools to break it. I possess leverage, Eldridge replied. Tell me the layout underneath. The station master hesitated. He huddled closer to the cook and the brakemen, hoarding their combined body heat. Dirt? The station master muttered. A 3-foot crawl space. Stone foundation walls wrap the perimeter. The wind blows straight through the gaps in the mortar. Does it connect to the main building? It runs the entire length of the structure, the station master confirmed. Piers support the floor joists. You hit dirt, you can crawl from here to the kitchen. But the perimeter sits sealed. Solid granite. I require interior access, no exterior exit, Eldridge said. He leaned his weight onto the knife handle. The muscles in his forearm knotted. The rusted iron rivet shrieked. It sounded like a nail pulled across a slate chalkboard. The traveling salesman in the center of the huddle let out a sharp whimper. They will hear that. They will come in here and shoot us. They sit by a roaring coal stove, Eldridge stated. The wind outside screams loud enough to drown a train whistle. They hear nothing. The rivet snapped. The sharp metallic pop echoed off the bare walls. The corner of the iron grate lifted a 1/4 inch. One, Eldridge said. He slid the knife blade down the edge of the iron rectangle, seeking the next anchor point. He located the second rivet in the dark by touch. He worked the steel wedge into the groove. You leave us here, Dora Reed whispered. Her voice floated from the pile of canvas mail sacks. It lacked the sharp authority she displayed in the main room. Blood loss and the bitter cold drained her reserves. Eldridge paused his work. He turned his head toward the dark corner. I secure a path, Eldridge told her. I clear the obstacles. I return before the snowplow arrives. Miller expects the key, Dora breathed. He expects me to break. Miller deals in logic, Eldridge said. Logic dictates you surrender the asset to save your life. He relies on your desire to survive. You frustrate his logic by refusing to die. My shoulder burns. Keep the pressure steady on the pad. The cold restricts the blood flow. You hold an advantage. Eldridge leaned into the knife again. He twisted the brass handle. The wood splintered. The second rivet popped free, striking the wall and dropping back to the floorboards. He moved to the third anchor point. Listen to me, Eldridge addressed the men huddled on the floor. I lift this iron, the temperature drops further. The wind tunnels up from the crawl space. You stay grouped. You share the warmth. Do not stand up. Do not approach the heavy door. What do we tell them if they check on us? The cook asked. They hold zero reason to check, Eldridge said. Miller locked the door. He threw the deadbolt. He believes the problem solved. If he speaks through the timber, you tell him the detective rests quiet. You offer no other details. Eldridge attacked the third rivet. Rust and time fused the metal to the wood. He pounded the pommel of the Bowie knife with the heel of his palm, driving the blade like a chisel. The impact bruised his hand. He ignored the sting. He applied violent upward force. The third rivet sheared. The iron shaft broke clean. He gripped the cast iron grate with both hands. He braced his boots against the floorboards. He pulled straight up. The final rivet tore through the rotted pine, bringing a chunk of wood with it. The heavy iron square came loose. Eldridge lifted it clear and set it silently aside. A blast of freezing air erupted from the square hole. It carried the smell of dry earth, dead leaves, and ancient dust. The draft hit Eldridge in the face, colder and sharper than the air in the baggage room. Jesus, the salesman cried out, feeling the new draft. We freeze in 10 minutes. You freeze if you panic, Eldridge said. He sheathed the Bowie knife. He moved to the edge of the hole. He lowered his legs into the void. His boots dangled in the empty space. "Dora," Eldridge called out softly. "I breathe," she answered. "Keep doing it." Eldridge let go of the floorboards. He dropped. He fell 3 feet. His boots hit soft, powdery dirt. He bent his knees, absorbing the short impact. Absolute blackness swallowed him. The crawlspace lacked any ambient light. Above him, the square hole offered a faint, charcoal gray outline against the pitch-black ceiling. He crouched low. The clearance forced him to stay off his feet. He rested his hands on the dry earth. The ground felt like talcum powder, fine and completely devoid of moisture. He heard the wind. It channeled through unseen gaps in the granite foundation, a low, constant moan that vibrated against his eardrums. The air moving under the depot held a bitter, biting chill. Eldridge reached up. He touched the rough-sawn timber of the floor joists. He used the wood to orient himself. The joists ran parallel, spaced 16 inches apart. They formed a grid, guiding him forward. He began to crawl. He moved on his hands and knees, keeping his head tucked low to avoid the rusted nails protruding through the subfloor. He navigated by touch and sound. He mapped the structure in his mind, correlating his movements below with the layout he had observed above. He moved past the boundary of the baggage room. He crawled under the wall plate, separating the storage area from the main depot. The acoustics changed instantly. The thick floorboards transmitted sound directly into the crawlspace. The wood acted as a sounding board. Eldridge stopped moving. He knelt in the dirt. He listened. He heard the crackle of the potbelly stove. The heavy cast-iron heater sat directly above him, maybe 20 feet to the right. The heat failed to penetrate the thick planks, but the sound of burning coal filtered down clearly. He heard voices, muffled but distinct in their cadence. "Check the perimeter windows," Silas Miller commanded. The cultured baritone resonated through the floor. "The snow drifts high on the west wall. Ensure the glass holds the weight." "The glass holds," another man answered. Eldridge turned his head. He tracked a new sound. Heavy, dragging footsteps moving across the depot floor. The distinct clink of silver spurs striking the wood. Hollis, the giant enforcer. Eldridge placed his right hand flat against the underside of the floorboard. He felt the vibration of the boots. Hollis walked a slow, methodical path. He moved from the ticket counter toward the front entrance. Eldridge mirrored the movement. He crawled silently beneath the floor, pacing the enforcer above him. The dry dirt puffed into his face. He breathed shallowly through his nose, keeping his mouth closed to avoid coughing. Hollis stopped. The vibration ceased. Eldridge stopped directly underneath him. Less than an inch of pine separated the drifter in the dark from the killer in the light. Eldridge listened to the scrape of a match striking leather. He heard Hollis inhale a sharp breath of tobacco smoke. "The telegraph wires stay down, Professor," Hollis stated, his heavy voice rumbling through the timber. "I checked the drop outside the window. Clean snap. Ice broke the line." "A fortunate occurrence," Miller replied from across the room. "It isolates our position. It guarantees absolute privacy until the train arrives." Eldridge lowered his hand from the wood. He gathered the intelligence. He verified their positions. He verified their confidence. He turned away from the heavy boots standing above him. He adjusted his mental map. The boiler room sat at the rear of the structure, providing heat to the back offices and the kitchen. The boiler room required a coal chute. A coal chute offered an access point from the subfloor. Eldridge resumed his crawl. He navigated the grid of wooden joists, moving deep into the dark underbelly of Summit Station, tracking the pulse of the enemy above while he hunted for the door to the inside. Chapter 7. The dirt tasted like old ash and dead spiders. Eldridge Sample kept his face an inch from the ground, crawling through the subfloor of Summit Station. He pulled himself forward using his elbows and the toes of his boots, navigating the narrow tunnel between the granite foundation and the thick pine joists. The cold down here felt different than the freezing air in the baggage room. It possessed a damp, heavy quality that sank into the joints and stayed there. He moved past the ticket office overhead. He moved past the main lobby where Silas Miller and his crew waited by the stove. He heard a shift in the sound of the wind. A hollow, rushing noise replaced the steady moan against the foundation stones. It sounded like air moving through a pipe. He dragged himself another 10 feet. His hand touched brick. He felt the rough, fired surface. He followed the brick wall upward until his fingers found a square opening set into the subfloor. The coal chute. A blast of warm, dry air hit his face. It carried the sharp, sulfurous smell of burning anthracite. Faint, flickering orange light spilled down the chute, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the crawlspace. Eldridge stopped. He drew the Colt Peacemaker. He rested the heavy barrel on the dirt. He listened. He heard the scrape of a steel shovel against stone. He heard the rattle of coal sliding into a firebox. He heard a man hum a tuneless song. One man, tending the boiler. Eldridge gripped the edge of the chute. He pulled himself up. The chute angled upward at 45 degrees, a ramp of smooth, polished tin designed to funnel fuel from the outside bins directly into the basement boiler room. He climbed the ramp. His boots found zero purchase on the slick metal, so he relied on upper body strength, hauling himself up by the sides of the chute. He reached the top lip. He peered into the boiler room. A massive cast-iron furnace dominated the space, radiating waves of intense heat. A single lantern hung from a ceiling beam, casting long, jumping shadows. A guard stood with his back to the chute. He wore a heavy wool coat, thick canvas trousers, and a battered derby hat. A Winchester rifle leaned against the wall near the door. The guard plunged a long-handled ash shovel into the open mouth of the furnace. He twisted the handle, clearing the grates. Eldridge holstered the Colt. A gunshot inside the boiler room would echo straight up the stairwell to the main depot. He needed silence. He needed the man's coat. He slid out of the chute. His boots hit the stone floor with a soft tap. The guard stopped humming. He froze, the shovel suspended halfway out of the firebox. He didn't turn his head. He tilted it, listening to the space behind him. "Hollis?" the guard asked. His voice sounded tight. "That you?" Eldridge stepped forward. He closed the distance in 2 silent strides. He didn't answer. He reached out with his left hand. He grabbed the back of the guard's collar, yanking the man backward, pulling him off balance. The guard yelled, stumbling. He swung the heavy ash shovel around, a blind, desperate arc aimed at his attacker's head. Eldridge ducked the swing. The shovel blade hissed over his hat. Eldridge drove his right fist into the man's kidneys. A short, brutal punch designed to break wind and shatter resolve. The guard gasped, his lungs emptying in a sudden rush. The shovel clattered against the stone floor. Eldridge didn't give him time to recover. He brought his right arm up, wrapping the crook of his elbow around the guard's throat. He locked his hands together behind the man's head, applying immediate, crushing pressure to the carotid arteries. The guard thrashed. He clawed at Eldridge's arm, his fingers digging into the canvas coat. He kicked backward, his boots scraping uselessly against the stone. "Sleep," Eldridge whispered into his ear. He tightened the choke hold. The guard's struggles weakened. His hands dropped. His head lolled forward. The fight drained out of him in 5 seconds. Eldridge lowered the unconscious man to the floor. He didn't check the pulse. He knew the pressure required to knock a man out without crushing the windpipe. The guard would wake up in 20 minutes with a severe headache and a confused memory. Eldridge worked fast. He stripped the heavy wool coat from the guard's body. He put it on, over his own canvas jacket. The wool felt thick, coarse, and incredibly warm. He patted the pockets. He found a handful of extra .44 caliber cartridges and a half-empty box of matches. He transferred the items to his own pockets. He retrieved the Winchester rifle from the wall. He checked the action, verifying a loaded chamber. He slung the rifle over his shoulder by its leather strap. He looked at the unconscious man lying in his shirt sleeves on the cold stone. Eldridge grabbed the guard by the ankles. He dragged him across the floor to a small storage closet under the stairs. He shoved the man inside and closed the door. It offered temporary concealment. He turned his attention to the wooden stairs leading up to the main floor. The stairs led to a narrow hallway connecting the boiler room, the kitchen, and the back offices. He adjusted the heavy wool coat. He pulled his hat brim down. He possessed heat. He possessed extra ammunition. He possessed a long gun. He altered the balance of the depot. He stopped playing the victim locked in the icebox. He started hunting the men who put him there. Eldridge took the first step up the wooden stairs. The board groaned slightly under his weight. He stopped, listening for a reaction from above. The depot remained quiet, save for the muffled roar of the wind outside. He climbed the rest of the stairs in silence, moving toward the hallway and the telegraph office where Silas Miller thought he controlled the communication lines. Chapter 8. The stairs to the second floor ran steep and narrow, closed in by beadboard walls that smelled of old varnish and dry rot. Eldridge climbed. He placed the outside edge of his boots on the treads, minimizing the creak of the old wood. He wore the stolen wool coat. It added bulk, restricting his arm movement slightly, but the insulation kept his core temperature stable. He carried the heavy Winchester rifle at port arms. He reached the top landing. A long, straight hallway stretched toward the front of the depot. 3 doors lined the right side, the passenger rooms. A single door sat at the far end, positioned directly over the main entrance. A small, hand-painted sign nailed to the wood read "Telegraph Operator." Light spilled from the crack under the telegraph office door. Eldridge moved down the hall. He passed room 4. He skipped the hotel rooms. He focused on the light at the end of the corridor. Miller's operation relied on isolation. The blizzard provided the physical barrier. Severing the communication lines provided the intellectual barrier. If Miller controlled the wire, he controlled the reality of Summit Station. Eldridge reached the office. He pressed his ear to the wood panel. He heard the rhythmic click-clack of a telegraph key. Someone was tapping the brass. A fast, competent rhythm. Eldridge frowned. The station master had sworn the line died an hour ago. The ice snapped the wire. If the line sat dead, tapping the key served no purpose. Unless the operator tested a repair, or unless the operator possessed a localized line, communicating with another point on the mountain. Eldridge gripped the brass doorknob. He turned it slowly. The latch clicked open. He pushed the door inward. He stepped into the room, raising the Winchester. A man sat at a small desk facing the frost-covered window. He wore a heavy sheepskin coat. A bowler hat sat pushed back on his head. He possessed a pair of headphones clamped over his ears, connected by a cord to the telegraph apparatus. His right hand danced over the brass key. He tapped a continuous sequence of Morse code. A double-barreled shotgun leaned against the desk leg. Eldridge closed the distance. The man remained oblivious, lost in the rhythm of the transmission and the insulation of the headphones. Eldridge reversed the Winchester. He gripped the barrel. He swung the heavy wooden stock in a tight, vicious arc. The curved butt plate connected with the back of the operator's head, right below the brim of the bowler hat. The man slumped forward. His forehead struck the telegraph key with a sharp, metallic clatter. The transmission ceased. He slid out of the chair, landing in a heap on the floorboards. Eldridge set the rifle down. He rolled the unconscious man onto his back. He verified the deep, even breathing. He stripped the headphones off the man's head. Eldridge sat in the chair. He put the headphones on. He listened to the wire. Static hissed in his ears. A low, constant crackle generated by the storm. He heard no returning signal, no acknowledgement of the transmission. He placed his hand on the brass key. He tapped a simple query. "Who is on the line?" He waited. The static hissed. Then a distinct pattern broke through the noise. Faint, degraded by distance and weather, but readable. Miller. Status. Eldridge pulled his hand back from the key. Miller wasn't communicating with Denver. He wasn't communicating with the valley. He was talking to his own people. The pieces fell into place. Miller stated the rotary snowplow arrived at dawn. He stated the train provided his exit. He planned to load the silver ore, commandeer the engine, and ride the cleared track down the western slope. But a snowplow required a crew. It required an engineer, a fireman, and guards. Taking the engine by force involved a pitched battle. Miller hated battles. He preferred precision. Unless he already controlled the plow. Unless the men on the rotary train belonged to Miller's crew. They rigged the entire operation. They robbed the express car on the lower slope. They retreated to the summit. They waited for their own stolen train to arrive to haul the loot away. They controlled the transportation network. The line wasn't dead. Miller lied to the station master. Miller cut the line to the outside world, but he maintained a localized loop to coordinate the rendezvous with his extraction team. Eldridge grabbed the brass key. He needed to send a different message. He needed to alert the rail yard in Denver. If he could bridge the broken connection, he could ruin Miller's perfect transit. He tapped the key. SOS. Summit Station compromised. Federal payroll targeted. He tapped the message blind, hoping the signal pushed past the break in the line, hoping a relay station picked up the faint transmission. He tapped the sequence a second time. A heavy boot kicked the solid wood door. The timber shattered inward, tearing the hinges from the jamb. The door slammed against the interior wall with a violent crash. Hollis filled the doorway. The giant enforcer wore the bearskin coat. He gripped a heavy, short-barreled shotgun in his massive hands. He looked at the unconscious man on the floor. He looked at Eldridge sitting at the desk wearing the headphones. Hollis did not ask questions. He did not issue threats. He operated on absolute brutal instinct. He raised the shotgun and pulled the trigger. Eldridge threw himself sideways. He dove out of the chair, abandoning the telegraph key and the headphones. The shotgun blast pulverized the desk. Buckshot shredded the wood, destroying the brass telegraph apparatus and shattering the frosted glass window. The cold air rushed into the room, instantly dropping the temperature. Eldridge hit the floorboards, rolling. He grabbed the Winchester rifle. He scrambled toward the hallway door, scrambling past the giant's boots. Hollis roared. He swung the heavy shotgun like a club, aiming for Eldridge's head. Eldridge ducked. The steel barrels hissed over his hat. He scrambled into the narrow hallway. He scrambled to his feet. He didn't fire the rifle. A rifle proved too long for the tight corridor. He ran. He sprinted toward the back service stairs. "I tear your arms off," Hollis bellowed, his voice echoing off the beadboard walls. The heavy footfalls of the enforcer thundered behind him, a relentless, pursuing force driving him deeper into the dark sections of the depot. Chapter 9. Hollis kicked the door a second time. The solid oak panel splintered around the heavy iron lock. The framing gave way with a sharp crack that echoed down the narrow corridor. The door slammed against the interior wall of the telegraph office. The massive enforcer stepped into the room. He filled the doorway, his broad shoulders brushing the jambs on either side. He carried a sawed-off, double-barrel shotgun. He held the weapon low, stock tucked tight against his hip, fingers resting on the twin triggers. He wore the bearskin coat, the thick fur making him look twice as wide. He did not look at the broken telegraph apparatus scattered across the desk. He looked directly at Eldridge. Eldridge ripped the heavy brass telegraph key from its mounting board. The screws tore free from the wood. He hurled the solid hunk of metal with absolute force. It flew across the short distance. It struck Hollis square on the right cheekbone. The impact produced a dull, wet thud. The skin split instantly. Blood welled up, bright and thick against the enforcer's pale skin, running down into the gray bristles of his beard. The force of the strike knocked Hollis's head back. It forced the shotgun barrels upward toward the ceiling. Eldridge moved. He dove to his right. He aimed for the secondary door, leading to the depot kitchen. He hit the swinging wooden panel with his shoulder. He crashed through the opening just as the enforcer recovered his balance. A shotgun blast chased him. The heavy buckshot shredded the doorframe. Wood fragments exploded outward, peppering Eldridge's canvas coat like angry hornets. Plaster dust drifted down from the walls in a fine white cloud. Eldridge hit the kitchen floor. He executed a tight roll on the glazed tiles. He sprang to his feet, facing the swinging doors. The industrial kitchen smelled of rendered lard, raw onions, and burnt coffee. Two massive iron stoves dominated the space, radiating waves of intense heat into the room. Coals glowed an angry bright red through the bottom grates. Iron pots bubbled on the flat tops, abandoned by the fleeing station cook earlier in the evening. A thick layer of grease coated the heavy butcher block tables. Hollis pushed through the swinging doors. He kicked them open with a heavy boot. He stepped inside. He dropped the empty shotgun. The weapon clattered against the tile floor, sliding under a prep counter. He reached behind his broad back. He drew a foot-long hunting knife from a leather sheath secured to his belt. The blade caught the ambient light from the glowing coals. "You die slow," Hollis promised. He offered zero emotion in the statement. He spoke it as a simple fact. Blood dripped from his cheek onto the collar of his shirt. He wiped it away with the back of his massive hand. He stepped forward. Eldridge backed up. He bumped his hips against a solid oak butcher block table. He kept his eyes fixed on the long steel blade. Hollis moved with shocking, fluid speed for a giant. He crossed the floor in 2 long strides, his heavy boots finding solid traction on the greasy tiles. He thrust the knife straight at Eldridge's midsection, a low, gutting strike. Eldridge twisted his torso to the side. He grabbed a heavy cast-iron skillet resting on the prep counter. He swung the iron with both hands. The heavy pan struck the flat side of Hollis's blade. Sparks jumped from the impact point. The collision sent a harsh, violent shockwave straight up Eldridge's arms, jarring his shoulder joints. Hollis absorbed the blow. He did not flinch. He stepped inside Eldridge's guard. He threw a massive left hook. A fist the size of a cured ham hit Eldridge square in the ribs. Eldridge lost his breath in a sudden rush. He stumbled backward. He crashed hard into a rack of hanging copper pans. The metal clanged, a deafening racket ringing in the confined, tiled space. He fought to pull air back into his lungs. Hollis lunged again. He swung the knife in a wide, vicious arc aimed directly at Eldridge's neck. Eldridge dropped the cast-iron skillet. He ducked low under the whistling blade. He drove his right shoulder hard into Hollis's midsection. Hitting the enforcer felt like tackling a solid brick wall. Hollis grunted, exhaling a short breath, but he did not yield an inch of ground. He brought the heavy brass pommel of the hunting knife down in a brutal, hammering strike, hitting Eldridge square on the spine. Pain flared bright white behind Eldridge's eyes. His vision blurred. He dropped to one knee on the slick tile. Hollis grabbed the collar of Eldridge's thick canvas coat. He hauled Eldridge upright with a single hand, displaying terrifying physical strength. He shoved Eldridge backward, pinning him against the front edge of the massive iron stove. The heat radiated through the heavy fabric of the coat, biting deep into the skin underneath. Hollis raised the hunting knife. He aimed the point directly at Eldridge's chest, preparing the final downward thrust. "You bought a short ticket," Hollis growled. Eldridge reached behind him. His fingers scrambled blindly across the wooden cutting board resting next to the stovetop. He felt the cold steel of a blade. He searched for the grip. He found a thick wooden handle. A heavy meat cleaver. He gripped it tight. He brought it around in a short, desperate upward arc. He slapped the heavy, flat side of the cleaver blade directly against Hollis's right wrist joint. He put his entire remaining strength into the swing. Bone snapped. The sound echoed loud, a distinct pop over the hiss of the boiling pots. Hollis roared. The sound tore from his chest. His thick fingers jerked open. The hunting knife clattered to the wet tile floor, spinning away toward the wall. Eldridge shifted his grip. He let the meat cleaver fall to the counter. He grabbed the wire handle of an enormous enamel coffee boiler resting on the hottest plate of the iron stove. The metal burned his palm, searing the skin. He ignored the burn. He ripped the boiler off the stove. He hurled the entire contents forward, aiming high. A full gallon of boiling black liquid and scalding steam hit Hollis directly in the face and chest. The giant released Eldridge's coat instantly. He shrieked. The sound tore through his vocal cords, a high, ragged pitch of pure agony. He clawed at his eyes with both hands. He staggered backward, stumbling away from the intense heat of the stove. Blistered, bright red skin peeled away from his cheeks where the boiling liquid struck. Hollis tripped over his own heavy boots. He hit the floor hard. He thrashed in a blind panic, slapping his massive hands against the wet tiles. He rolled back and forth, attempting to extinguish the burning sensation. Eldridge stood over him. He drew ragged, deep breaths, filling his bruised lungs. He rubbed his spine where the pommel had struck. He watched the massive man roll in agony on the floor. Hollis remained alive, but he lacked the capacity to fight. The brute force of the operation lay broken and blinded on the tiles. Heavy boots thundered down the main hallway outside the kitchen doors. The shotgun blast had alerted the rest of the crew in the main lobby. Miller's men rushed toward the noise, their voices shouting commands. "Hollis!" a voice yelled from the corridor. "Check the back rooms." Eldridge stepped away from the stove. He located the heavy wooden door leading to the dry goods pantry. He pulled the iron latch. He slipped inside the dark, cramped room. Shelves lined the walls, stacked high with provisions. He pulled the door shut, easing the latch into place without making a sound. He stood in the pitch blackness. He smelled flour sacks, dried apples, and stale spices. He drew his Colt Peacemaker. He cocked the hammer. He listened to the kitchen doors swing open on the other side of the wood, waiting for Silas Miller and his armed men to survey the wreckage. Chapter 10. "Step through the doors," Silas Miller ordered. Shaw pushed the swinging wooden panels. He entered the depot kitchen first. He led with the barrel of his Winchester rifle, sweeping the sights across the room. He checked the deep shadows near the ceiling beams. He checked the narrow gap between the cast-iron stoves. Burke followed close behind. His boots found zero traction on the slick, wet glazed tiles. He braced his shoulder against the doorframe to keep from falling. Miller walked in last. He kept his double-barreled Greener shotgun rested over his left forearm, the breech broken open, exposing the twin brass shells. He projected absolute calm. Steam filled the room, thick and gray. The air held the heavy scent of rendered lard, raw onions, and the bitter stench of scorched coffee grounds. A second, sharper smell mixed with the food odors. The smell of blistered, peeling meat. Hollis thrashed on the floor. The giant enforcer rolled back and forth across the wet tiles. He slapped his massive hands against his face. He released a continuous, ragged whine that scraped against the brick walls. His heavy boots kicked blindly at the base of the iron stove, denting the tin ash catcher. Jesus, Shaw breathed. He lowered his rifle. He stared at the man on the floor. Look at his face. Miller approached his enforcer. He looked down. He displayed zero pity. He exhibited the mild irritation of a man discovering a broken tool in his kit. "Stop screaming, Hollis," Miller said. Hollis gasped. He pulled his hands away from his face. The skin on his cheeks and forehead hung in loose red sheets. Giant, weeping blisters formed thick over his eyelids. He blinked rapidly, attempting to clear a vision that remained permanently clouded by scalded tissue. "Professor," Hollis choked. He spit a mouthful of bloody saliva onto the tiles. "He burned me. The water." He threw the boiling water. Miller inspected the floorboards. He catalogued the wreckage. The heavy leather sheath on Hollis's belt hung empty. The foot-long hunting knife lay near the solid oak prep counter. A heavy meat cleaver rested 2 feet away, a smear of fresh blood coating the flat steel. A large enamel coffee boiler lay on its side across the hot iron grates of the stove. Black liquid dripped onto the floor, hissing and spitting steam as it struck the hot metal. Miller looked at Hollis's right arm. The wrist bent inward. The bone protruded against the skin, forming a hard, unnatural lump. "He broke your wrist," Miller stated. "He hit me with the iron," Hollis sobbed. He clutched his ruined arm against his chest. He rocked back and forth. "He forced you to drop your blade," Miller said. He walked past Hollis, stepping over the man's thrashing legs. "He blinded you. He accomplished this entire demolition without pulling the trigger of his Colt. He conserved his ammunition. He used the kitchen." "He fights dirty," Shaw said from the doorway. Shaw brought his rifle back up. He swept the muzzle toward the pantry door, the back exit, the shadowed corners near the dish racks. "He fights smart," Miller said. The cultured baritone voice never wavered. "He faces a superior force. A direct confrontation guarantees his death. He chooses isolation. He chooses the dark." Miller walked to the dry goods pantry. The heavy wooden door sat shut. The iron latch rested securely in the closed position. Miller raised his polished boot. He kicked the iron latch. He kicked the door open. Shaw and Burke brought their rifles to bear. They tightened their fingers on their triggers. They prepared to fire a volley into the small space. The pantry held sacks of flour, crates of dried apples, and glass jars of stale spices. It held 0 drifters. "He departed," Miller said. He turned away from the empty pantry. "We sweep the back rooms," Burke suggested. He kept his rifle aimed at the hallway. "We flush him out. We corner him in the baggage hold." "You walk into the back rooms, you walk into his trap," Miller said. "He waits in the shadows. He watches you carry a lantern. He watches you step into a lighted hallway. He strikes from the blackness. He turns our own illumination against us. He makes you a target." "So we leave him?" Shaw asked. "We let him roam the building. We changed the environment," Miller said. He walked back into the hallway corridor. Shaw and Burke followed. They left Hollis whimpering on the kitchen tiles. The giant offered them zero further utility. The operation required able bodies, and Hollis lacked eyes and a trigger hand. They walked past the telegraph office. The solid wood door hung in jagged splinters from the jams. The telegraph operator lay unconscious on the floorboards, a thick purple welt rising behind his ear. The brass telegraph key sat in pieces on the desk, destroyed by the shotgun blast Hollis fired earlier. Miller paused at the threshold. He looked at the severed wires dangling from the wall. He looked at the operator. "He severed our communication," Miller noted. He tapped the key before Hollis interrupted him. He attempted to summon help. "The lines are down in the snow," Shaw said. "I snapped them hours ago." He signaled a dead wire. "He signaled a chance," Miller said. "He leaves nothing on the table. He tries every door." They reached the main lobby of Summit Station. The heat from the potbelly stove hit them. The fire burned low, the red coals fading to gray ash inside the iron belly. The station master, the cook, and the wounded Pinkerton detective remained locked inside the baggage room on the north wall. Heavy timber benches barred the oak doors. 5 kerosene lamps hung from the exposed ceiling beams. They cast wide pools of yellow light across the pine floorboards. The light pushed the shadows deep into the corners of the room and up into the rafters. Miller stood dead center in the lobby. He looked up at the hanging lamps. He adjusted his wire-rimmed spectacles. The glass lenses reflected the yellow flames. "He exploits the contrast," Miller said. Shaw lowered the barrel of his Winchester. He frowned. "Contrast?" "He relies on stealth," Miller explained. "He navigates the unlit spaces. He hides where the light fails to reach. He watches us move through the illuminated center of the room. We present clear targets. We provide him with absolute visibility. We hand him the advantage." "We need more lanterns," Burke said. He backed up until his shoulders touched the log wall. He kept his eyes moving. "We light the whole depot. We bring lamps from the back rooms. We burn every shadow out." "More light creates more shadows," Miller said. "We fight a man who utilizes the dark as a weapon. We must remove his advantage. We must dictate the rules of the engagement." Miller raised the double-barreled Greener shotgun. He closed the breech with a sharp snap. He nestled the heavy wooden stock against his right shoulder. He aimed the twin black bores at the nearest kerosene lamp hanging 10 feet away over the ticket counter. "What are you doing, Professor?" Shaw asked. His voice spiked with sudden alarm. Miller pulled the front trigger. The shotgun roared. The blast shattered the glass chimney into 1,000 glittering fragments. Kerosene sprayed across the rough-sawn ceiling beams. The flame ignited the atomized fuel for a split second, a bright flash of orange fire, before the kinetic shockwave snuffed it out completely. Shards of glass rained down onto the floorboards. The biting smell of sulfur and spilled lamp oil filled the lobby. One pool of yellow light vanished. The shadows crept forward, claiming a fifth of the room. Miller broke the shotgun action open. He ejected the smoking brass shell. It hit the wood floor with a metallic clink. He loaded a fresh cartridge from his pocket. He snapped the weapon shut. "Shoot the lamps," Miller ordered his men. Shaw stared at him. He looked at the shattered fixture. He looked at the encroaching dark. "We blind ourselves." "We blind him," Miller corrected. "He wants to fight in the dark. We give him the dark. We plunge this station into absolute blackness. We force him to move without a visual reference. We force him to make a sound before he strikes." Miller raised the shotgun again. He fired the second barrel. Another glass chimney exploded in a shower of sparks and fuel. Another section of the room surrendered to the gloom. "Shoot them," Miller commanded. The cultured voice held a hard edge of absolute authority. "Every single one." Shaw raised his Winchester. He aimed at a lamp near the front entrance. He hesitated for a second, fighting his own survival instincts. He pulled the trigger. The glass shattered. The light died instantly. Burke fired his rifle at the lamp above the potbelly stove. The report echoed loud against the log walls, ringing in their ears. Miller reloaded the greener. He took deliberate aim at the final lamp hanging near the hallway corridor. He squeezed the trigger. The heavy buckshot obliterated the brass fixture and the glass globe. The blast destroyed the last source of illumination. Absolute blackness consumed the depot. The wind howling outside the frosted windows became the only sound in the world. The acrid smell of burnt powder and wet kerosene choked the cold air. The remaining heat from the stove provided zero light, only a faint, dying warmth. Miller stood in the pitch black. He held his shotgun ready across his chest. He listened to the nervous, shallow breathing of his two remaining men. He listened for the scrape of a boot or the rustle of a canvas coat. "Now," Miller whispered into the dark. "The board is level. Find him." Chapter 11. Eldridge pressed his spine against the rough-hewn pine boards. The hallway swallowed all light. Silas Miller understood tactics. Miller broke the kerosene lamps. Miller plunged the depot into absolute blackness. Eldridge listened. The human ear adapts when the eyes fail. A floorboard groaned. 10 yards to his left. The heavy, deliberate tread of a work boot. A piece of fabric brushed against wood. 10 yards to his right. A different man. They executed a pincer movement. They closed the gap from both ends of the narrow corridor. "You run out of real estate, drifter," a raspy voice echoed from the east end. The smell of cheap, foul cigars drifted down the hall. "We blocked the stairs. We blocked the kitchen. You stand in a wooden box." "A dark box," a second voice called from the west. A younger man. He carried a nervous tremor in his pitch. "I despise the dark. Let us strike a match and finish this." "You strike a match, you create a target," the raspy voice snapped. Miller gave strict orders. "Keep it black. Shoot the sound. You hear him breathe, you fill the space with lead." Eldridge remained motionless. He controlled his breathing. He drew shallow, silent breaths through his nose. He felt the wall behind his back. Solid timber framing. He reached his left hand forward. His fingertips met cold, smooth glass. A large window. Condensation froze on the inside pane. The storm hammered the outside glass. The heavy wooden frame rattled under the force of the gale. "Step into the open," the raspy voice demanded. "Drop the iron. We make it fast. You bleed out in the dark. It takes hours. You feel every minute." "You offer a poor bargain," Eldridge said. He kept his tone flat and level. He projected his voice straight down the center line of the corridor. "You work for a man who shoots women. You work for a man who botched a train job. Your boss makes errors." "The boss holds the silver," the young voice countered. A heavy boot scraped the floor. He took a step closer. "The boss holds the entire depot. You hold nothing." "I hold a Colt," Eldridge corrected. "I hold a full cylinder. You walk into the dark, you catch a bullet." "Miller offered a bounty," the raspy voice said. The distinct metallic clack-clack of a pump-action shotgun shattered the quiet. The man chambered a shell. $20 gold. "The man who brings your hat to the lobby gets the coin." $20, Eldridge repeated. "A cheap price. You throw your life away for the cost of a decent saddle." "I buy the saddle after I step over your corpse," the raspy voice grunted. You imagine a victory, Eldridge said. You ignore the reality. The reality is 2 shotguns against 1 revolver, the young voice said. Another step. The floorboard creaked loud under his weight. The reality is you die in the dark. Eldridge felt the freezing draft seep through the window edges. The glass presented the only exit. A fatal drop under a clear sky. But the mountain blizzard raged outside. The snow built deep drifts against the foundation. The storm provided a shield. He unbuttoned the heavy canvas coat. He kept his right hand wrapped tight around the walnut grips of the peacemaker. He pulled the thick wool collar high over his ears. He grabbed the heavy canvas fabric of the coat lapels. He dragged the material over his head. He wrapped it tight across his face and neck. He formed a thick, padded helmet against the impending impact. He needed a distraction. He needed them to fire. He needed the bright flash of the muzzles to destroy their adjusted night vision. $20 gold, Eldridge called out. He shifted 3 feet to the left of his original stance. He stood directly in front of the center glass pane. Come earn the wage. Twin blasts erupted. A double roar shook the confined walls. Orange fire bloomed at both ends of the black corridor. The shotgun blasts illuminated the space for a fraction of a second. Heavy lead buckshot tore through the air. The deadly pellets chewed into the pine boards where Eldridge stood a moment prior. Splinters the size of matchsticks exploded from the wall. The brilliant muzzle flashes burned into the gunmen's retinas. They stared into blinding afterimages. Eldridge moved. He lowered his shoulder. He drove his boots hard against the floor. He launched his entire body weight forward. He aimed his mass directly at the center of the frosted window. He struck the glass. A violent, deafening crash. The heavy plate shattered. Jagged shards tore through the air. The thick canvas coat deflected the sharp edges. The wooden window frame splintered around his shoulders. He broke through the solid barrier. He fell into the freezing void. The brutal cold hit him like a physical punch to the chest. The temperature dropped 40 degrees in a single second. The mountain wind roared. The sound resembled a massive freight train rushing through a narrow tunnel. Gravity seized him. He plummeted 10 feet. He crashed into the massive snowdrift banked against the north side of the depot. The deep, powdery snow swallowed him. It absorbed the kinetic shock of the fall. He sank deep into the freezing white blanket. He hit the frozen earth beneath the drift. He rolled. He kept the Colt peacemaker raised above the snow line. He kicked his legs. He fought the heavy, clinging drag of the deep powder. He scrambled away from the drop zone beneath the shattered window. He pulled the canvas coat down from his face. Complete blind white. A solid wall of driving snow erased the world. He lost sight of his own boots. The wind ripped the oxygen straight from his lungs. Microscopic ice crystals lashed his face. They stung like a swarm of angry hornets. Above him, the shattered window framed a rectangle of blackness against the white storm. The 2 gunmen leaned out over the jagged sill. They fired blind into the driving snow. Pump-action blasts and lever-action rifle cracks cut through the wind. The bullets thumped into the snowdrifts. They struck empty air. Eldridge crouched low. He pressed his back against the rough granite foundation of the train depot. The wind tore the sound of the gunfire away. He went out the glass, the raspy voice yelled. The gale distorted the words, stretching them thin. The crazy bastard jumped out. Shoot him, the young voice screamed. Shoot what? I see white. Just white. The wind burns my eyes. Eldridge needed immediate shelter. A man dies in minutes in a high mountain blizzard. The cold penetrates the flesh. The cold freezes the marrow. The blood slows to a crawl. The mind drifts into a warm, fatal sleep. He recalled the layout of the depot exterior. He studied the adjacent structures when he rode the bay horse into the stable hours ago. A massive pile of split cordwood sat 10 yards from the kitchen door. The station master kept a fuel reserve for the winter engines. Eldridge stood up. The wind shoved him hard against the granite wall. He fought the immense pressure. He leaned his weight forward. He took a heavy step into the storm. The snow reached his upper thighs. Every step required a massive exertion of force. The cold seeped through his denim trousers. The wet fabric froze against his skin. His bare fingers turned numb against the steel of the revolver. He kept the stone wall on his right side. He used the foundation as a guide wire. He moved away from the broken window and the blind gunfire. He reached the corner of the building. He stepped past the edge. The wind caught him full force. The gale knocked him to his knees. He tasted dirt and ice. He forced his body to stand. He pushed forward into the blind white. A dark, solid shape loomed ahead. The wood pile, stacked 8 feet high and 20 feet long. Heavy logs cut from seasoned mountain pine. The snow blanketed the top layer, but the leeward side offered a narrow pocket of dead air. He reached the stacked timber. He squeezed his body into a tight gap between the logs and the depot wall. The wind howled inches from his face, but the solid wood broke the direct force of the gale. He shivered. A violent, uncontrollable shaking racked his shoulders. He holstered the peacemaker. He shoved his bare, freezing hands deep into the pockets of the heavy canvas coat. He waited in the dark gap. Silas Miller maintained a stubborn streak. Miller needed every loose end tied and buried. Miller would send men out into the storm. Miller would force them to hunt the ghost in the snow. Eldridge settled his spine against the rough pine bark. He welcomed the hunters to the killing cold. Chapter 12. Cold breaks a man down from the outside inward. The wind drove ice crystals into Eldridge Sample's face. He wedged his body deep into the narrow gap between the stacked pine logs and the depot foundation. The rough cordwood offered a shield against the direct blast, but the temperature continued to plunge. He lost the feeling in his toes 10 minutes ago. His fingers resembled stiff, dead twigs. He shoved his bare right hand under his left armpit. He needed blood flow. He needed the trigger finger to bend on command. The heavy kitchen door swung open on the far side of the woodpile. The iron hinges shrieked. The storm caught the solid oak panel, slamming it against the exterior wall with a violent crash. 2 men stepped out into the whiteout. They wore thick buffalo hide coats and pulled scarves high over their noses. They carried repeating rifles. They stood on the threshold, leaning their weight into the howling gale. "I see 0 tracks," the first man yelled. He shouted with full lung capacity to cut through the roar of the wind. "The snow fills them the second you pick your boot up." Miller gave an order. "Shaw," the second man bellowed back. "We find the drifter. We leave him in the snow. You want to return inside and tell the professor you quit." "I want to keep my nose, Burke. The wind burns the skin right off my face." "Fan out," Burke ordered. "Walk the perimeter. Check the drifts." He jumped out the window. He caught a broken leg or a busted rib. He crawls in the snow. "Find the blood." Burke racked the lever of his Winchester. He stepped off the porch and plunged into the thigh-deep powder. He headed right toward the front of the station. Shaw lingered near the door. He stamped his boots. He hugged his rifle against his chest. He looked into the solid wall of driving white. He took a reluctant step forward. He moved left. He headed straight for the woodpile. Eldridge stood still in the gap. He regulated his breathing. He let the chill sink into his bones, accepting the pain, refusing to shiver. Shaw waded through the drift. The snow dragged at his knees. He kept his chin tucked to his chest. He held his eyes in a tight squint. The blowing ice blinded him. He passed within 3 feet of the stacked pine. He looked right at the dark gap. He saw shadows. He saw 0 men. Eldridge drew the heavy Bowie knife from his belt sheath with his left hand. His right hand remained tucked in his armpit, conserving warmth for the gun. He stepped out of the wood pile. The wind masked the sound of his boots. The storm erased his approach. He moved through the deep powder. He closed the distance in 3 long strides. He grabbed the back of Shaw's thick coat collar. He jerked the man backward. Shaw lost his footing. He pitched into the deep snow. He opened his mouth to scream. Eldridge drove his left knee into Shaw's chest, pinning the man beneath the surface of the drift. He brought the brass pommel of the Bowie knife down hard against Shaw's temple. The blow shattered bone. Shaw went limp. The fight left him before he realized the hunt had started. Eldridge shoved the body deep into the powder. The howling wind covered the noise. The driving snow began to bury the dark coat. Within 10 seconds, Shaw vanished from the face of the earth. Eldridge stood up. The wind shoved him back a step. He braced his boots against the hidden earth. 1 down. He turned his face into the gale. He searched the white void for Burke. Shaw. Burke's voice drifted through the storm. The sound arrived thin and distorted. Report your position. Shaw. Eldridge waded forward. He kept the granite wall of the depot on his right side. He used the stone structure for a bearing. In a complete whiteout, a man wanders blind and dies of exhaustion. Answer me. Burke yelled. Panic laced the words. Eldridge spotted a dark shape moving through the blizzard. 20 yards ahead. Burke spun in place, holding his rifle at his shoulder. He pointed the barrel at the blowing snow. He hunted a threat he failed to see. Shaw, Burke screamed. I command you to answer. Eldridge stopped moving. He stood still as a fence post. He let the snow coat his canvas jacket. He blended into the storm. Burke turned toward Eldridge. He peered into the wind. The ice crystals battered his eyes. He raised a gloved hand to shield his face. Show yourself, drifter, Burke roared. I possess a loaded rifle. Step out. Eldridge pulled his right hand from his armpit. The flesh felt stiff, sluggish, but the joints moved. He drew the Colt Peacemaker. He thumbed the hammer back. He took a heavy step forward. Burke heard the snow crunch. He spun. He leveled his Winchester at the dark shape materializing out of the white wall. I see you, Burke yelled. He pulled his trigger. The rifle bucked. A tongue of orange flame shot from the muzzle. The bullet cut the air to Eldridge's left side. It buried itself in a snowdrift. Eldridge raised the Colt. He aimed at the middle of the dark coat. He fired. The heavy slug punched through the thick buffalo hide. It struck Burke in the chest. Burke staggered backward. The rifle dropped from his hands. He fell onto his back in the deep snow. Eldridge walked forward. He stood over the fallen man. Burke stared up at the swirling sky. He gasped for breath. Red froth bubbled at the corners of his lips. He clutched his chest with gloved hands. Cold, Burke whispered. The wind almost stole the word. So cold. Eldridge looked down at him. He offered 0 comfort. He offered 0 apologies. The mountain takes the heat, Eldridge said. He turned away. He holstered the Colt. He left Burke in the drift. He walked back toward the depot. The snow filled his tracks the second he lifted his boots. The storm scrubbed the slate clean. 2 hunters stepped out the door. 2 corpses rested in the ice. Eldridge reached the broken window. He looked up at the black hole in the log wall. Silas Miller sat inside the building. Miller held the warmth. Miller held the hostages. The hunt in the snow stood finished. The siege required a new approach. Eldridge flexed his freezing fingers. He prepared to initiate a conversation with the professor. Chapter 13. Eldridge Sample stepped over Burke's body. He walked back to the stone foundation of Summit Station. He followed the granite wall. He moved with slow, deliberate steps, letting the deep powder absorb the sound of his boots. He reached the corner of the building. He stopped. He pressed his back against the rough stone. He peered into the howling whiteout. The shattered window gaped like a black, jagged mouth in the log wall, 10 feet above the snowdrifts. A kerosene lantern flared inside the depot. The harsh yellow light spilled out through the broken glass, illuminating a thick cone of swirling snow. Silas Miller stood framed in the window. The professor wore his expensive coat, but he lacked the calm, academic posture he displayed earlier in the evening. His wire-rimmed spectacles reflected the lantern light. His jaw set in a hard, rigid line. The sophisticated veneer cracked, exposing the desperate predator underneath. Miller held Dora Reed. He gripped the Pinkerton detective by the collar of her ruined blue traveling suit. He shoved her forward, forcing her upper body out into the freezing wind. Dora hung limp. Her face showed zero color. The blood loss from the shoulder wound painted her skin a stark, translucent white. Her eyes remained closed. She drifted on the absolute edge of consciousness. She lacked the strength to fight the grip holding her suspended over the drop. Miller jammed the twin barrels of his greener shotgun against the back of Dora's head. "Mr. Sample," Miller shouted. His cultured baritone voice carried surprising volume. It cut through the roar of the mountain blizzard. It reached Eldridge in his dark corner. "I recognize a change in the weather," Miller yelled into the storm. "My men step outside. They fail to return. They fail to report. You removed them from the board." Eldridge remained silent. He let the wind howl. He let Miller stare into the blinding white. "I applaud your efficiency," Miller continued. "You dismantled a superior force. You utilized the environment. You demonstrated tactical brilliance. I underestimated the resilience of a saddle tramp." Miller adjusted his grip on Dora's collar. He pulled her back an inch, ensuring she did not slip from his grasp. "But the game concludes," Miller roared. "The board resets. I hold the asset. I dictate the terms." Eldridge checked the cylinder of his Colt Peacemaker. 3 loaded chambers remained. He snapped the gun shut. He evaluated the geometry of the situation. Miller stood 10 feet up. A difficult angle for a precision shot in a raging blizzard. The wind altered bullet trajectories. The blowing snow obscured the target. A slight miscalculation meant putting a .45 caliber slug through the hostage's skull. Miller knew the math. Miller used the woman as a shield. "Show yourself," Miller demanded. "I offer a conversation. A business transaction." Eldridge stepped out from the cover of the stone corner. He waded into the cone of yellow light spilling from the broken window. He stopped 10 feet from the wall. The snow reached his waist. He kept his hands visible. He kept the Colt holstered on his hip. He lifted his face into the biting wind. "You yell loud for a man holding a losing hand," Eldridge called out. Miller squinted through his fogged spectacles. He saw the drifter standing in the drifts, the heavy canvas coat caked with ice. "I hold the winning hand," Miller corrected. He shoved the shotgun barrels harder against Dora's neck. "I hold the Pinkerton. I hold the station master. I hold the cook. Their continued breathing depends entirely upon your cooperation." You killed a man holding a ticket, Eldridge said. You killed a man maintaining the boiler. Your word lacks value. Those men presented obstacles, Miller said. The current situation presents an opportunity. The snowplow train arrives at dawn. I intend to depart on that train. I require the key to the express car vault. The detective claims she lost it, Eldridge lied. The detective lies, Miller said. She carries the commission. She carries the key. And she shared a dark room with you. She surrendered it to the most capable man in the depot. Miller leaned out the window. The wind whipped his gray-streaked beard. I offer a simple exchange, Mr. Sample. You toss the brass key through this window. You walk away. I secure my cargo. I depart on the morning train. The hostages survive the night. You promise the passengers they survive the night if they stay quiet, Eldridge noted. I alter the terms, Miller said. You force my hand. I lack the manpower to maintain control and search the depot for hidden brass. I require immediate compliance. You get the key, you eliminate the witnesses, Eldridge said. You burn the building down. You blame the destruction on the blizzard. A perfect, clean exit. Miller smiled. A cold, flat expression that contained zero warmth. You project your own cynical worldview onto my operation, Miller said. I am a man of my word. Deliver the key, and I leave the civilians unharmed. I decline the offer, Eldridge said. Miller's smile vanished. He cocked the right hammer of the greener shotgun. The heavy metallic clack echoed loud over the wind. You miscalculate the leverage, Miller warned. I hold a hostage. I possess a shotgun. You possess a liability, Eldridge said. You shoot the woman. You lose the only person who knows the secondary location of the key. You lose the key. You lose the silver inside the vault. You leave this mountain empty-handed. Miller hesitated. The logic hit him. A dead detective offered zero answers. He needed the key to access the payroll. He needed the payroll to complete the score. I possess other hostages, Miller threatened. I fetch the station master. I execute him in this window. I fetch the cook. I execute him next. You shoot the civilians, you alert the incoming train crew, Eldridge said. The snowplow carries guards. They hear gunfire. They approach with rifles ready. They find bodies in the snow. They assume a hostile takeover. Your clean exit turns into a firefight at the platform. Eldridge took a heavy step forward, fighting the deep powder. You hold zero leverage, Eldridge stated. You stand in a freezing room, holding a dying woman. You lack a crew. You lack an exit strategy. I hold the dark. I hold the cold. Miller gripped the window frame with his left hand. The knuckles turned white. His precise, scheduled operation unraveled before his eyes. The intellectual thief faced a man who refused to play the academic game. The drifter operated on raw, brutal arithmetic. I hold the dynamite, Miller screamed. The words tore from his throat. The cultured baritone cracked. Panic laced the threat. I wired the baggage room door, Miller yelled into the storm. I utilized a full case of blasting gelatin. I hold the fuse. You refuse my terms, I light the fuse. I blow the civilians to dust. Eldridge stopped moving. The cold clamped down on his chest. Miller possessed explosives. He brought dynamite to blow the express car safe in case he failed to secure the key. He repurposed the tool. He turned the depot into a massive bomb. I set a 5-minute fuse, Miller roared. I strike the match right now. You have 5 minutes to walk through the front doors of this depot. Unarmed. You surrender the key. I extinguish the flame. You stay out in the snow. The building burns. Miller did not wait for an answer. He hauled Dora Reed backward into the depot. He vanished from the window frame. Eldridge stood in the blizzard. He listened to the wind. He stared at the empty black rectangle in the log wall. Miller changed the board. He introduced a ticking clock. He offered a choice between a suicidal frontal assault and the absolute destruction of innocent lives. Eldridge drew the heavy Bowie knife from his belt. He looked at the thick, unyielding granite blocks forming the foundation of Summit Station. He had 5 minutes. He had zero intention of using the front door. Chapter 14. Eldridge Sample stood still. The wind ripped across the flat expanse of the depot platform, driving horizontal lines of sharp ice crystals through the beam of yellow lantern light. Silas Miller occupied the broken window frame. He gripped the collar of the wounded Pinkerton detective. He dragged Dora Reed back from the edge of the jagged wooden sill. She slumped against the interior log wall, vanishing from sight. The yellow light continued to spill into the storm, but the stage sat empty. 5 minutes, Mr. Sample. Miller's cultured voice floated over the roar of the gale. The baritone held a desperate, ragged edge. The fuse burns. The gelatin explodes. Deliver the key to the front door. The clock ticks. The ultimatum hung in the frozen air. Eldridge evaluated the mathematics of a ticking fuse. Miller repurposed his mining explosives. Blasting gelatin offered tremendous destructive force. It lacked the stability of standard black powder. A full case possessed enough concussive energy to reduce the heavy timber depot to splinters. The explosion would vaporize the baggage room and every civilian locked inside it. Miller offered a frontal assault through the main doors. A suicidal bottleneck. The heavy oak panels opened inward. Miller and his remaining gunmen would barricade the interior lobby. They would aim their rifles at the opening. A man walking through those doors walked into a sheer wall of lead. Eldridge drew the heavy Bowie knife from the leather sheath on his belt. The brass pommel felt freezing against his numb palm. He stared at the thick granite blocks forming the foundation of Summit Station. He required an alternate entry. He required a breach that Miller failed to calculate. The roof offered access, but the steep pitch and the heavy slate shingles presented a difficult, slow climb in a raging blizzard. The windows sat barred or guarded. The crawl space beneath the floorboards remained an option, but navigating the tight dirt tunnels consumed too much time. A 5-minute fuse demanded immediate execution. He patted the deep pockets of his stolen wool coat. His bare fingers brushed against the heavy, wax-coated cylinders he had extracted from the pockets of Hollis, the giant enforcer, during their brutal fight in the kitchen. 3 sticks of commercial dynamite. Hollis carried them for breaching heavy safes. Eldridge carried them for contingencies. He pulled the 3 sticks from his pocket. They felt dense and cold. He located the short fuses extending from the copper blasting caps embedded in the ends of the sticks. He needed to create a door. He needed to blow a hole straight through the structural integrity of Miller's fortress. He waded through the deep snowdrifts. He kept his back pressed flush against the granite foundation wall. He moved away from the cone of light spilling from the broken window. He navigated the perimeter of the building, heading toward the east side of the depot. The east wall presented a solid face of heavy interlocking pine logs resting on the granite base. 0 windows. 0 doors. The interior side of this wall formed the back of the main lobby, directly behind the spot where Miller likely established his barricade. Eldridge stopped. The snow piled high against the stone foundation. He knelt in the freezing powder. He jammed the heavy Bowie knife into a gap between 2 massive granite blocks. He wedged the blade deep into the frozen mortar. The thick steel flexed under his weight. He created a narrow, deep crevice He pulled the knife free. He jammed the 3 sticks of dynamite into the gap, packing them tight against the solid stone and the bottom log of the wall. He pulled a wooden match from his vest pocket. His fingers shook violently. The cold bit deep into his joints. He pinched the matchstick between his thumb and forefinger. He struck the sulfur head against the rough granite. The wind instantly snuffed the spark. Eldridge cursed the storm. He repositioned his body. He knelt closer to the foundation, using his heavy canvas coat and his torso to build a small, sheltered windbreak around the dynamite. He pulled a second match. He struck the stone. The match flared. A tiny, fragile yellow flame. He cupped his frozen hands around the flame. He guided the fire toward the twisted ends of the 3 short fuses protruding from the wax cylinders. The fuses caught. They sputtered and hissed. A sharp smell of burning sulfur and gunpowder pierced the scent of snow and pine. The sparks crawled down the fuses, burning fast toward the copper caps. Eldridge scrambled backward. He fought the deep snow. The powder sucked at his knees, dragging his boots down. He threw his body backward, pushing away from the foundation wall. He dove behind a massive, snow-covered stump, sitting 10 yards from the depot. He hit the ground. He covered his head with his arms. He buried his face in the snow. He counted the seconds. Miller controlled a 5-minute fuse. Eldridge controlled a 10-second fuse. The speed of the breach dictated the success of the rescue. The earth shuddered. A deafening, concussive roar ripped through the mountain air. The sound drowned out the howling blizzard. A massive shockwave hammered the ground, vibrating through the solid stone and the deep snow. The 3 sticks of dynamite detonated simultaneously. The explosion tore a jagged, smoking hole straight through the east wall of Summit Station. Heavy pine logs splintered into 1,000 jagged pieces. Chunks of granite foundations sailed through the air, raining down on the snowdrifts like deadly hail. A thick cloud of gray smoke and pulverized wood dust billowed out from the breach, instantly whipped away by the gale-force winds. The blast shattered the structural integrity of Miller's stronghold. It bypassed the heavy oak doors. It bypassed the guarded windows. It created a raw, gaping wound, leading directly into the heart of the main lobby. Eldridge stood up. His ears rang with a high, constant whine. The concussive force rattled his teeth. He drew the Colt Peacemaker. He cocked the heavy hammer. He did not wait for the dust to settle. He charged forward. He vaulted over the snow-covered stump. He sprinted toward the smoking breach in the wall. The smell of burnt powder and vaporized pine filled his nose. He hit the jagged edge of the hole. He stepped over the shattered remains of a heavy log. He stepped onto the pine floorboards of the depot lobby. The interior sat in chaos. The explosion had obliterated the back wall of the room. A massive wave of snow and freezing air rushed into the heated space, instantly killing the warmth of the potbelly stove. The blast had flipped a heavy wooden table and shattered the remaining glass in the front windows. Silas Miller lay sprawled on the floorboards, 10 feet from the breach. The concussive shockwave had thrown him across the room. His expensive coat was covered in wood dust and soot. His wire-rimmed spectacles hung crooked on his face. The double-barreled Greener shotgun rested on the floor, knocked from his grasp. Miller groaned. He rolled onto his side. He shook his head, fighting the ringing in his ears. He reached a trembling hand toward the fallen shotgun. Eldridge stepped over a piece of burning timber. He leveled the long barrel of the Colt Peacemaker at Miller's chest. "The 5 minutes expired," Eldridge announced. The flat, calm voice cut through the ringing silence following the explosion. Miller froze. His hand stopped inches from the shotgun stock. He looked up. He saw the drifter standing in the smoking hole in the wall, outlined by the raging blizzard behind him. The intellectual thief stared down the black bore of the .45 caliber revolver. Eldridge held the high ground. Chapter 15. "You possess a flair for the dramatic," Silas Miller said. He lay flat on the ruined pine floorboards. Pulverized wood and gray soot coated his expensive wool coat. Blood stained the silver hairs of his neat beard. He ignored the heavy black bore of the .45 caliber Colt Peacemaker aimed directly at his face. "Stand up," Eldridge ordered. Miller shifted his weight. His left hand slid toward the interior pocket of his ruined jacket. "Keep your hands empty," Eldridge said. He cocked the hammer. The metallic snap echoed sharp in the freezing, ruined lobby. Miller stopped his hand. He smiled. The explosion had stripped away his sophisticated academic veneer. A cornered predator looked back from the floorboards. "You breached the perimeter wall," Miller said. His cultured baritone carried a raw scrape. "You assume the board resets. You calculate a victory based on a single broken timber." "The board shrank," Eldridge said. "You lack your gunman. You lack your enforcer. You lack an exit route. The game concludes. I maintain contingencies." Miller grabbed a fistful of pulverized plaster and fine wood ash from the debris field surrounding him. He whipped his arm in a tight, vicious arc. The blinding gray cloud hit Eldridge straight in the face. Eldridge pulled the trigger. The heavy revolver roared. The lead slug chewed a massive, jagged splinter out of the floorboards where Miller had rested a fraction of a second prior. Miller scrambled on his hands and knees. He moved with the shocking, desperate speed of a feral dog. He abandoned his greener shotgun. He threw his body behind the massive cast-iron bulk of the overturned potbelly stove. The thick iron deflected a second shot from the Peacemaker. Sparks showered the room. Eldridge stepped sideways. He sought an angle around the heavy iron. He wiped the stinging dust from his eyes with his left sleeve. Miller vaulted over the wooden ticket counter. He crashed hard into the station master's secure cage. He did not stop to engage. He dove headfirst through the heavy timber door leading to the rear freight corridor. The door slammed shut behind him. An iron deadbolt engaged with a heavy, final thud. Eldridge stood in the center of the lobby. The mountain blizzard poured through the blasted hole in the east wall. Snow gathered in drifts on the indoor floorboards. The temperature plummeted, freezing the sweat on his neck. He approached the ticket counter. He kept the Colt raised. He checked the deep shadows. He checked the blind corners. The lobby remained devoid of targets. The wind screamed through the jagged timber opening. He kicked the broken shotgun away from his boots. "You hear me, Mr. Sample?" The voice vibrated through the solid oak door. Miller shouted through the heavy wood. "I hear a man hiding in a closet," Eldridge answered. "I occupy the reinforced freight office," Miller corrected. "The station master stores the payroll box in this room. The railroad builds thick walls to deter amateurs. You lack the dynamite to breach a second barricade. You exhausted your supply on the exterior wall." Eldridge inspected the door. Thick iron hinges. Solid oak planks. A reinforced steel frame built into the foundation stones. Breaking the barrier required heavy sledgehammers or shaped charges. He possessed neither. "I sit in the lobby," Eldridge said. "I block your path to the tracks. The snowplow arrives at dawn. I flag the train crew. I explain the situation. You ride down the mountain wearing iron cuffs." Miller laughed. A dry, harsh sound scraping against the timber. "You misunderstand the leverage," Miller shouted. "You focus your attention on the path to the train. You forget the assets left behind." Eldridge narrowed his eyes. The wind tore at his canvas coat. He looked across the ruined lobby. He looked at the heavy door set into the north wall. The baggage room. Frost obscured the stenciled letters. He remembered the terrified civilians huddled in the pitch-black icebox. He remembered Dora Reed bleeding onto the canvas mail sacks. "I visited the baggage room while you crawled through the snowdrifts," Miller announced. "I appreciate an audience for my structural engineering." Eldridge walked toward the north wall. He kept his boots light on the floorboards. He listened to the wind. "I transported a full case of commercial blasting gelatin," Miller said. "I intended to utilize it on the express car vault. A delicate operation requires a stable explosive. Gelatin offers supreme concussive force." Eldridge stopped 3 feet from the baggage room door. He saw the modification. Miller had packed the heavy iron hinges with pale, putty-like bricks. Thick bundles of the explosive covered the sliding iron bolt. A long coil of gray fuse wire snaked away from the doorframe. The wire ran across the pine floorboards. It disappeared under the gap beneath the solid oak door of the freight office where Miller hid. "You wired the lock," Eldridge stated. "I wired the entire frame," Miller corrected. "The volume of gelatin packed against that timber holds enough kinetic energy to vaporize the door. The shockwave travels inward. It turns the baggage room into a sealed pressure cooker. The station master, the cook, the brakeman, the Pinkerton detective. They become red dust. They cease to exist." Eldridge traced the path of the fuse. The gray cord lay flat against the wood. "You light that fuse, you destroy the depot," Eldridge said. "You bring the heavy slate roof down on your own head. You die in the collapse." "I reside inside a reinforced steel box," Miller said. "The freight office withstands the blast. I experience a loud noise. I experience a minor concussion. The civilians experience absolute annihilation." Eldridge raised his boot. He aimed his leather heel at the gray cord. He prepared to stamp the fuse, severing the connection between the hidden thief and the explosive charge. "Step away from the wire," Miller roared. The command lacked the cultured polish. It held pure, venomous intent. "You possess a large knife. You might attempt to cut the cord. You might attempt to stomp it. I offer a warning. I hold the end of the line. I feel the tension in the weave. You touch that fuse, I strike the match." Eldridge hovered his boot an inch above the floorboards. He lowered his foot. He backed away from the gray wire. He understood the mechanical trap. Miller controlled the ignition point. Any disturbance, any vibration translated through the cord, forced Miller to light the flame. "You desire a standoff," Eldridge said. "I desire a transaction," Miller yelled. He pounded a fist against the interior of the oak door. The wood shuddered. "I desire the master brass key. I desire an unobstructed path to the morning train. The key remains hidden." "Then you locate it," Miller screamed. "The detective knows the location. Ask her. Bleed the truth out of her. I require the asset." Eldridge stood in the freezing lobby. He watched the gray fuse. "I offer a new arrangement," Miller announced. His breathing sounded heavy, amplified by the confined space of the freight office. "A ticking clock clarifies the mind. It removes hesitation. It forces action." Eldridge heard the scrape of a wooden match against stone. The sharp scent of sulfur drifted from under the freight office door. "I hold a lit flame," Miller said. "The cord measures 5 minutes. A precise length for a precise time frame." A tiny spark shot out from under the heavy timber. The end of the gray fuse caught the fire. The flame hissed. It sputtered. A thick plume of white smoke rose toward the log rafters. The spark began to crawl along the pine floorboards. It moved toward the baggage room door. It moved toward the bricks of pale, blasting gelatin. "The clock ticks, Mr. Sample," Miller said. The baritone smoothed out. The professor regained his academic detachment. He enjoyed the mathematics of the trap. You face an arithmetic problem. 5 minutes until the baggage room detonates. Eldridge watched the spark travel. It moved at a slow, brutal pace. 1 inch every few seconds. The burning cord smelled like saltpeter and scorched cotton. Extinguish the flame, Eldridge said. You possess the power to extinguish it, Miller replied. I dictate the instructions. You follow them. The fire stops. State your terms. You locate the key, Miller said. You secure the asset from the detective. You walk to the front entrance of the depot. The main double doors. You unbar them. The explosion destroyed the lobby, Eldridge said. The east wall sits open to the storm. I demand the front doors, Miller shouted. The formal entrance. You unbar the heavy timber. You walk outside. You stand on the platform. You stand in the snow. You leave your weapons inside. The revolver. The large knife. You carry the key. Nothing else. Eldridge tracked the fuse. It covered 2 feet of floorboard. 4 minutes remained. I walk outside, Eldridge repeated. I freeze on the platform. You wait, Miller instructed. I emerge from the freight office. I secure the key from your hand. I verify the brass. I extinguish the fuse with inches to spare. The civilians survive. I board my train. The transaction concludes. You step out, you hold a shotgun, Eldridge said. You shoot an unarmed man in the snow. A risk you must accept, Miller said. You balance your own survival against the lives of 5 innocent people locked in a meat locker. You balance your life against the life of Dora Reed. You choose. The fire chooses for you. The white smoke thickened in the lobby. The acrid stench of burning powder filled Eldridge's lungs. He looked at the smoking hole in the east wall. He looked at the heavy oak doors forming the front entrance. Miller created a fatal funnel. He wanted Eldridge stripped of weapons, standing in the open, blinded by the blizzard. Miller planned to retrieve a hidden rifle, step into the lobby, and shoot the drifter through the open front doors. He harbored zero intention of extinguishing the fuse. He wanted the key, he wanted the drifter dead, and he wanted the witnesses reduced to ash. A flawless sweep of the board. 3 minutes, Miller called out. The cord burns faster in the cold draft. Oxygen feeds the chemical reaction. Eldridge holstered the Colt Peacemaker. He evaluated the baggage room door. The gray wire crawled across the floor, a relentless, hissing serpent. It approached the packed bundles of blasting gelatin. He looked at the thick timber, barricading the front doors. Do you retrieve the key, Mr. Sample? Miller asked. The voice dripped with a mocking tone. Do you capitulate to superior intellect? Eldridge offered zero response. He turned away from the baggage room. He turned away from the burning fuse. He ignored the front doors. He walked toward the overturned potbelly stove. He grabbed a heavy iron poker resting near the scattered gray coals. He gripped the iron tight in his right hand. I hear boots moving, Miller shouted. I demand a status report. The fuse reaches the halfway mark. Eldridge kept walking. He approached the blasted east wall. He stepped into the howling mountain storm. The deep powder embraced his boots. The wind ripped the heat from his skin. He refused the front door. He refused the rules of the professor's game. A 5-minute fuse offered a lifetime for a man willing to climb. Eldridge tilted his head back. He stared up the side of the freezing granite foundation. He stared at the sheer icy face of the depot exterior, leading to the slate roof. He gripped the iron poker. He sought a purchase in the stone. Chapter 16. 1 minute left on the wire. The voice pierced the heavy timber walls. Silas Miller projected his demands from the reinforced freight office. The mountain wind caught the words, tearing them to shreds, tossing them across the deep snowdrifts surrounding Summit Station. Eldridge stood at the base of the granite foundation. The cold bit into his exposed skin. He held the heavy iron stove poker in his right hand. The metal felt like a block of solid ice. The curved hook at the end offered a crude tool for a desperate climb. "You freeze on the platform," Miller roared. "You refuse the terms. You condemn the detective. You condemn them all." Eldridge ignored the shouts. He turned his face to the sheer stone wall. The massive granite blocks rose 20 feet to the roofline. Ice filled the mortar joints. A thick glaze coated the rough rock face. He stepped out of the waist-deep snowdrift. He jammed the pointed tip of the iron poker into a horizontal groove between two massive blocks. He drove the steel deep into the frozen mortar. He tested the hold. The iron held firm. He wrapped his leather glove around the freezing iron shaft. He squeezed the metal. He tested the friction. He pulled his entire body weight upward. The muscles in his back coiled like heavy rope. His boots left the deep powder. His soles scraped against the ice-slicked stone. The smooth leather found zero traction. He kicked the toe of his right boot into a narrow, vertical seam. The stiff toe jammed into the crack. He shifted his weight onto the single foothold. The blizzard had turned his heavy canvas coat into a solid sheet of ice. The frozen fabric crackled with every movement. It acted like a rigid shell of armor. It fought against his joints. It restricted his reach. He reached up with his left hand. His bare fingers clawed at a protruding rock edge. The granite felt like rough sandpaper coated in grease. He dug his short nails into the seam. He hauled himself up another 2 feet. "The spark reaches the doorframe," Miller screamed from inside the structure. "I smell the smoke. The gelatin prepares to cook." Eldridge freed the iron poker. He swung his right arm up in a wide arc. He drove the metal hook into a fresh crack higher on the wall. The impact sent a violent shock straight down his forearm. Bone ground against bone in his shoulder joint. He locked his jaw. He swallowed a groan. His muscles burned. The cold leached the strength from his limbs. His fingers turned clumsy and thick. He ignored the failing nerves. He forced the joints to bend. He commanded the flesh to hold the stone. The wind battered his back. The gale tried to peel him off the wall. It ripped the breath straight out of his lungs. He kept his face pressed close to the freezing stone. He breathed shallow, ragged gasps. He kicked his left boot higher. The leather slipped on a patch of black ice. His leg dropped. His entire body weight jerked downward. The sudden drop wrenched his left hand. Skin tore from his fingertips. Blood smeared the white frost. The iron poker arrested his fall. The metal groaned in the mortar joint, but it stayed wedged. Eldridge hung by one arm. He dangled 15 feet above the snowdrifts. He gritted his teeth. He swung his leg back to the wall. He found a new foothold. He pushed upward. He needed to reach the roofline. The pitch of the roof extended past the granite wall. It created a 2-foot wooden overhang. Thick icicles hung from the eaves. They resembled the jagged teeth of a massive winter beast. The wind howled through the ice, creating a high, piercing whistle. Eldridge reached the top row of stone blocks. He jammed the iron poker into the wood of the overhang. He struck the timber with immense force. The pointed tip pierced the frozen pine boards. The metal wedged deep. He let go of the stone face. He grabbed the edge of the roof with his free hand. He pulled his chest over the icy lip. He kicked his legs into empty air. He fought the heavy gravity, dragging him back to the ground. He rolled onto the steep incline. The roof of Summit Station pitched at a sharp slant to shed the heavy mountain snowfall. Dark slate shingles overlapped in precise rows. Rime ice coated the stone tiles, creating a frictionless surface. A misstep meant a 30-foot slide into the void. A broken neck in the snowdrifts below. Eldridge drove the iron poker down like a harpoon. The hooked end shattered a brittle slate tile. The steel bit deep into the pine sub-roofing underneath. The slide stopped. His boots dangled over the edge of the abyss. He lay flat against the steep pitch. He straddled the roof ridge. The wind-up here shrieked with unholy fury. It scoured the mountain pass without mercy. He crawled toward the center of the structure. He navigated by the dark shapes of the stone chimneys protruding from the snowpack. He mapped his position in his head. He pictured the layout of the rooms below. The lobby. The ticket counter. The freight office. A tin stovepipe jutted from the roof near the center ridge. Smoke whipped away from the opening the instant it emerged. The pipe connected directly to the cast iron heater inside the freight office. It acted as a speaking tube. Miller's voice echoed up the metal cylinder. 30 seconds, Miller shouted. The sound distorted inside the tin, echoing with a metallic ring. I hear nothing. You failed the challenge. You left them to burn. Eldridge shimmied close to the pipe. He anchored his boots against a raised seam in the slate. He leaned his head toward the metal opening. You look the wrong direction, Professor, Eldridge spoke into the pipe. He kept his voice flat. The tin carried the words straight down into the secure room. Silence answered him for 3 heartbeats. Then Miller replied. You reside on the roof, Miller said. The panic returned to the cultured voice. The slate holds solid. The timber holds strong. You lack the time to dig through the structure. The fuse burns down to the nub. You watch the explosion from a grandstand seat. I planned this transit for 6 months. Miller yelled, his voice cracking. I scouted the routes. I studied the snowpack. The rotary plow arrives on my schedule. You represent a minor delay. A bump in the tracks. You talk too much for a man holding a winning hand, Eldridge answered. He released the iron poker. He reached deep into the left pocket of his frozen coat. His stiff fingers touched a waxy cold cylinder. He pulled the stick of explosive free. He had stripped the cylinder from Hollis's heavy coat during the kitchen fight. Hollis carried the tool for breaching steel safes. Eldridge carried it for altering architecture. The waxy paper felt slick against his numb skin. He traced the short gray fuse extending from the copper blasting cap. The wind whipped the cord back and forth. He needed to shield the ignition point. I claim the silver, Miller screamed up the pipe. I claim the victory. You die a forgotten saddle tramp in the snow. Eldridge crawled over to a weak spot in the decking. He located a section where the slate tiles had shifted during past storms. The gap exposed the heavy timber boards underneath. This spot sat flush above the heavy iron door of the freight office. Flush above Miller's secure box. He jammed the stick of explosive between the exposed wooden planks. He wedged the cylinder tight against the timber. He scooped a handful of loose ice from the roof tiles. He packed the frozen snow around the top of the stick. The dense pack directed the concussive force downward, straight through the wood. He needed fire. He lay on his right side. He pulled the heavy canvas coat open, forming a dark, windless cavern against his chest. He reached into his vest pocket. He retrieved a single wooden sulfur match. He struck the red head against the rough brass buckle of his gun belt. The sulfur sparked. A tiny, fragile yellow flame loomed in the dark. He brought the tiny flame to the end of the fuse. The cord caught. It sputtered, throwing bright yellow sparks against the canvas lining of his coat. Eldridge rolled away. He scrambled back toward the roof ridge. He pushed himself flat against the slate. He covered the back of his neck with both hands. He opened his mouth to equalize the pressure in his ears. The explosive detonated. A concussive roar tore the sky apart. The blast ripped a massive hole through the slate shingles. It shattered the heavy timber decking. Splinters the size of javelins launched into the blizzard. A thick pillar of gray smoke and pulverized pine erupted from the breach. The structural integrity of the roof vanished. Eldridge did not wait for the smoke to clear. He sprang to his feet. He sprinted down the slick pitch of the roof. He launched his body off the edge of the jagged smoking hole. He dove into the abyss. He fell through the pitch blackness. He dropped 20 feet through the empty air of the exposed rafters. The wind vanished. The freezing cold vanished. The stale, trapped air of the attic rushed past his face. He crashed through the secondary ceiling of the freight office. Wooden lath shattered. White plaster exploded on impact. He hit the pine floorboards inside the reinforced room. The impact drove the breath from his lungs in a sudden, violent rush. He executed a tight shoulder roll, absorbing the brutal shock of the fall. He crashed into a heavy oak desk. Wood splintered. Plaster dust rained down from the ruined ceiling, forming a blinding, choking white cloud. Silas Miller stood 5 feet away. The professor stared at the gaping hole in his ceiling. He held a lit match in his right hand. He held a shotgun in his left. Shock paralyzed his face. The predator mask shattered, replaced by absolute naked terror. Eldridge pushed himself to his feet. He drew the Colt Peacemaker. He leveled the long steel barrel at Miller's chest. "The trap breaks," Eldridge said. Chapter 17. White plaster dust drifted through the freezing air like a second snowstorm. Eldridge Sample stood in the center of the ruined freight office. He kept the long barrel of the Colt Peacemaker leveled at Silas Miller's chest. A jagged hole gaped in the ceiling above them. The mountain gale poured through the breach, battling the stale, trapped air of the secure room. Miller held a burning wooden match in his right hand. He held the double-barreled shotgun in his left. He stared at the drifter, who had just dropped through solid slate and timber. The match burned down to Miller's fingertips. The flame bit his skin. He flinched. He dropped the smoking stick to the floorboards. "Drop the scattergun," Eldridge ordered. Miller tightened his grip on the varnished stock. His knuckles turned stark white. The cultured thief processed the collapse of his flawless plan. He searched the room for an exit. He found 0 avenues of escape. A massive section of the damaged roof shifted. The heavy pine decking gave way. A burning roof timber crashed through the ceiling breach. The thick flaming logs slammed onto the floorboards between the two men. A shower of bright orange sparks erupted in the confined space. The impact sent a violent shockwave through the room. Miller lost his footing. He stumbled backward. He crashed hard against the solid oak wall. The shotgun slipped from his grasp. It clattered to the floor, sliding under a heavy wooden desk. Eldridge did not flinch. He kept the revolver aimed steady. The burning roof timber rested against a stack of dry railroad ledgers. The paper caught the embers. Small yellow flames licked the edges of the pages. The fire spread to an overturned wooden chair. The dry pine crackled. Thick black smoke began to curl toward the ceiling. "Unlock the door," Eldridge said. He nodded toward the heavy iron deadbolt, securing the exit to the lobby. Miller pushed himself off the wall. He wiped plaster dust from the lapel of his expensive coat. He adjusted his wire-rimmed spectacles. The panic receded from his face, replaced by a cold, arrogant calm. "The fuse burns in the lobby, Mr. Sample," Miller said. The baritone voice recovered its smooth edge. The gray cord crawls toward the blasting gelatin. "You lack the time to orchestrate a formal surrender. Open the door." You possess a singular focus, Miller noted. He took a deliberate step toward the exit. You ignore the fire building in this room. You ignore the cold wind. You care only for the locked door and the people behind it. A fatal flaw in a man of your profession. Miller reached the solid oak door. He rested his left hand on the heavy iron deadbolt. He did not throw the latch. His right hand drifted toward a wooden coat rack standing in the corner. An elegant black walking stick rested against the pegs. A silver handle, shaped like a snarling wolf, capped the dark wood. I traveled the continent in my youth, Miller said. He closed his fingers around the silver wolf head. I studied under men who considered firearms a crude, vulgar tool. They preferred precision. They preferred the immediate, intimate connection of cold steel. Miller twisted the silver handle. A sharp, metallic click echoed over the crackle of the burning ledgers. Miller pulled his arm back. He slid a 3-foot length of polished Toledo steel from the wooden scabbard. The blade hissed. It caught the yellow light of the growing fire. It lacked a cutting edge, possessing instead a thick, triangular cross-section tapering to a needle-sharp point. A thrusting weapon. A rapier disguised as a gentleman's accessory. He dropped the hollow wooden cane to the floor. He turned to face Eldridge. He assumed a sideways stance. He bent his knees. He raised the steel blade, pointing the tip directly at Eldridge's throat. You bring a fist to a duel, Miller said. Eldridge squeezed the trigger of the Colt Peacemaker. The heavy revolver roared. The .45 caliber slug tore through the air. Miller moved. He dropped his shoulder and pivoted his hips with practiced fluid grace. The lead bullet missed his ear by an inch. It smashed into the oak door behind him, burying itself deep in the thick timber. Eldridge cocked the hammer for a second shot. Miller lunged. He pushed off his back foot, crossing the distance in a blur of motion. He thrust the steel blade forward. Eldridge twisted his torso. He swept his left arm down to deflect the strike. The sharp tip of the rapier sliced through the thick fabric of his frozen canvas coat. The steel grazed his ribs, cutting a shallow burning line across his skin. Miller recovered his stance. He danced backward, out of reach. He kept the point of the blade trained on Eldridge. Heavy iron limits your speed, Miller observed. He tracked the bleeding cut on Eldridge's side. You require time to cock the hammer. You require distance to aim. I require neither. I own the close quarters. The fire climbed the wall. The dry pine paneling ignited. The heat intensified, pushing against the freezing draft from the roof hole. The smoke grew thick, stinging their eyes. Eldridge realized the layout favored the fencer. The narrow freight office restricted his movement. Desks and crates cluttered the floor. Miller possessed the reach and the footwork to dominate the tight space. Eldridge needed the open lobby. He needed to reach the gray cord, burning toward the baggage room. He gripped the Peacemaker. He threw himself forward. He did not aim for Miller. He aimed for the heavy wooden desk resting between them. He hit the oak surface with his shoulder. He drove his boots into the floorboards. He shoved the massive piece of furniture forward. The desk slammed into Miller's shins. The impact broke the fencer's elegant stance. Miller stumbled backward, waving his left arm to catch his balance. The rapier dipped toward the floor. Eldridge vaulted over the moving desk. He ignored the man with the sword. He grabbed the heavy iron deadbolt on the oak door. He threw the latch. He kicked the timber panel open. The door crashed back on its iron hinges. Eldridge spilled out into the ruined lobby. The mountain blizzard howled through the blasted hole in the east wall. Snow swept across the floorboards. The wind cleared the smoke, revealing the absolute chaos of the room. Smashed furniture littered the space. The potbelly stove lay on its side, dead and cold. Eldridge scanned the floor. He searched for the gray wire. He spotted the cord. The tiny bright yellow spark crawled across the pine planks. It left a scorched black trail in its wake. The fuse sat 3 feet from the heavy oak door of the baggage room. The pale bricks of blasting gelatin hung packed around the iron hinges. 3 feet of cord equaled a handful of seconds. Eldridge sprinted. His boots pounded the floorboards. He fixed his eyes on the hissing spark. A shadow moved in his peripheral vision. Silas Miller burst through the freight office doorway. The professor abandoned his academic posture. Rage contorted his features. He pursued his prey into the freezing wind. Miller intercepted Eldridge's path. He brought the rapier up in a high, sweeping arc. He slashed downward, aiming for Eldridge's gun hand. Eldridge raised the heavy steel barrel of the peacemaker to block the strike. The triangular blade clashed against the revolver barrel. The impact rang like a blacksmith's anvil. The force of the blow shocked Eldridge's freezing fingers. His grip failed. The Colt slipped from his hand. It clattered against the floorboards and skittered away, sliding under a broken bench. Eldridge stood disarmed in the center of the lobby. Miller stepped between Eldridge and the baggage room door. He positioned himself over the burning fuse. He guarded the bomb. "The transaction stands canceled," Miller breathed. His chest heaved. Sweat tracked through the soot on his face. He kept the bloody tip of the sword leveled at Eldridge's heart. "You lose the key. You lose the hostages. You lose the game." The gray cord hissed near Miller's polished boot. The spark chewed through the weave. 2 feet remaining. Eldridge looked at the empty holster on his hip. He looked at the steel blade hovering inches from his chest. He looked past Miller to the smoking bomb attached to the heavy timber door. The civilians trapped inside the icebox waited for the end of the world. Eldridge reached down to his gun belt. His right hand bypassed the empty leather holster. His fingers found the thick, heavy brass handle protruding from the sheath on his hip. He drew the Bowie knife. The massive steel blade caught the faint light of the fire spilling from the freight office. It lacked the refined elegance of the Toledo rapier. It possessed brutal weight. A broad, thick spine and a razor-sharp edge designed for butchering meat and splitting bone. Eldridge dropped into a low crouch. He held the heavy knife out in front of him, the blade angled upward. "A butcher's tool," Miller scoffed. He tightened his grip on the silver wolf head handle. "It cuts meat," Eldridge said. The spark passed the final marker on the floorboards. The fuse shortened. The smoke plumed thicker. Eldridge stepped forward into the reach of the fencer's blade. He committed to the steel. The fire roared in the office behind them. The blizzard screamed through the broken wall. The time for conversation was over. Chapter 18. "A clumsy instrument," Silas Miller said. He held the Toledo steel rapier extended. The needlepoint traced a tight, glittering circle in the smoke-filled air. He bounced on the balls of his expensive leather boots, light and fluid. Fit for skinning deer. Fit for splitting kindling. It lacks the refinement required for human anatomy. Eldridge Sample kept his knees bent. He felt the immense weight of the Bowie knife in his right hand. 10 inches of forged, high-carbon steel. A broad, thick spine tapering to a razor edge. The solid brass crossguard offered minimal protection against a targeted thrust. "It gets the work done," Eldridge said. He glanced at the floorboards. The gray cord hissed. The bright yellow spark chewed through the weave. 18 inches remained between the fire and the stacked bricks of blasting gelatin packed against the baggage room door. A handful of seconds. Miller noticed the shift in focus. He exploited the distraction. The professor lunged. He dropped his left shoulder, extending his right arm in a blur of motion. The silver blade darted forward, aiming straight for Eldridge's throat. Eldridge snapped the heavy bowie up. The blades collided. The impact rang sharp and bright, a high-pitched scream of metal striking metal. Miller absorbed the kinetic shock through the flexible Toledo steel. He withdrew the tip in a fraction of a second. He circled his wrist, initiating a second strike before Eldridge could reset his heavy guard. The triangular blade whipped past the brass crossguard. It ripped a jagged tear through the heavy canvas of Eldridge's coat. The steel sliced into the meat of his left forearm. Hot blood spilled from the cut. It soaked the torn wool sleeve. It hit the freezing air and began to steam. A sharp, burning sting radiated up to his shoulder. Miller danced backward, pulling his weapon clear. He maintained the distance. He kept the point of the sword hovering between them. "I dictate the perimeter," Miller announced. He drew a deep breath. Sweat cut clean tracks through the gray soot coating his face. The long blade commands the open space. You carry a heavy burden. You swing wide, you leave an opening. You leave an opening, I pierce your heart. Eldridge tightened his grip on the bowie handle. The brass felt slick with his own sweat. He wiped his palm against his denim thigh. He evaluated the geometry of the fight. The narrow rapier possessed superior reach and blinding speed. Miller operated like a coiled spring, striking and retreating. The heavy butcher knife required close quarters. It required a brutal, tight clinch to utilize its mass. Eldridge needed to cross the gap. He needed to trap the silver needle. The mountain wind howled through the blasted hole in the east wall. The gale drove thick sheets of snow across the ruined lobby. The white powder hissed against the burning timbers scattered across the floorboards. Plaster dust drifted from the ceiling, clinging to their coats like gray ghosts. Behind them, the fire inside the freight office roared. The flames consumed the dry pine paneling. The intense heat crashed against the sub-zero blizzard wind, creating violent, swirling drafts in the center of the room. 12 inches on the wire, Miller called out. He offered a dead smile. The station master begins to pray. I hear him through the oak door. Eldridge heard it too. A muffled, frantic voice begging for deliverance from the sealed icebox. Dora Reed remained silent inside the dark room. She bled on the canvas sacks, waiting for the drifter to break the iron. You fail them, Mr. Sample. Miller lunged a third time. He executed a low feint, dipping the point toward Eldridge's thigh. Eldridge dropped the bowie to parry the low strike. Miller flipped his wrist. The feint evaporated. The true strike came high. The needle tip drove upward in a steep angle, seeking the soft tissue under Eldridge's jaw. Eldridge threw his head backward. The tip of the rapier grazed his chin, slicing the skin. A warm trickle of red ran down his neck. He refused to retreat. He stepped forward, pushing into the fencer's space. He swung the massive bowie in a wide horizontal arc. He aimed for Miller's ribs, hoping the sheer weight of the steel would cleave through the expensive wool coat. Miller stepped back, out of range. The heavy blade sliced empty air. Brute force, Miller mocked. He reset his stance. Predictable. Slow. Eldridge drew ragged breaths. The cold air burned his lungs. The bruised ribs from the fight with Hollis ached with every movement. He bled from his arm and his chin. The physical toll mounted. His muscles felt heavy, loaded with lead. He glanced at the floor again. 6 inches. The spark illuminated the pale wrapper of the first explosive brick. The smell of burning saltpeter overpowered the scent of the wood smoke. Eldridge altered his stance. He lowered his right arm. He let the bowie knife hang by his side. He opened his posture, exposing his chest. He presented a clear, unobstructed target to the fencer. Miller narrowed his eyes behind the wire-rimmed spectacles. He read the body language. He saw a man surrendering to exhaustion. He saw an opponent yielding the board. "You recognize the inevitable," Miller said. He raised the silver wolf head handle to his eye level. He sighted down the length of the polished steel. "A rational decision. I end it clean." Miller committed his entire body weight to the final thrust. He pushed off his back foot. His leather boot scraped the pine floorboards. He shot forward, an arrow released from a tight bow. He aimed the triangular point directly at the center of Eldridge's chest. He intended to drive the steel straight through the breastbone. Eldridge did not dodge. He did not retreat. He stepped into the strike. He twisted his torso at the absolute last fraction of a second. He presented his left side to the incoming blade. The rapier tore through his heavy canvas coat. It pierced his wool vest. It slid along his ribcage, carving a deep, agonizing furrow through the muscle, but it missed the vital organs. Eldridge ignored the tearing pain. He had invited the strike. He had absorbed the hit to close the distance. He brought his right arm up. He swung the heavy Bowie knife down with crushing force. He did not aim for flesh. He aimed for steel. The flat of the heavy butcher blade slammed against the thin Toledo rapier, inches from the silver hilt. The impact snapped the rapier downward. The flexible steel bent under the massive weight of the Bowie. Eldridge pinned Miller's weapon against his own hip, trapping the blade, nullifying the reach advantage. Miller's eyes widened. Shock shattered his arrogant calm. He tried to rip the sword free. The blade remained pinned. He found himself trapped within inches of the drifter. "I prefer the close work," Eldridge whispered. Eldridge released his grip on the Bowie handle. He left the heavy knife wedged against his hip, holding the rapier down. He grabbed the lapel of Miller's expensive coat with his bleeding left hand. He pulled the thief forward, off balance. He closed his right hand into a solid fist. He drove his knuckles upward in a short, brutal uppercut. He missed the jaw. He aimed lower. He drove his fist into the center of Miller's chest. He hit the sternum with the force of a swinging sledgehammer. Miller gasped. The air rushed out of his lungs. His knees buckled. Eldridge did not stop. He grabbed the solid brass pommel of the Bowie knife with his right hand. He ripped the heavy blade free from the bind. He brought his arm up in a tight, vicious arc. The heavy brass butt of the knife handle slammed into the side of Miller's jaw. Bone shattered. The distinct, dry crack echoed over the roaring fire. Teeth broke loose. The kinetic force of the strike lifted Miller off his boots. The thief spun in the air. He crashed face first onto the pine floorboards. The silver-handled rapier clattered away, sliding into the snowdrifts near the broken wall. Miller lay motionless. Blood pooled under his ruined jaw. Eldridge did not check for a pulse. He spun around. He dropped to his knees. He threw his body toward the heavy oak door of the baggage room. The spark touched the pale, putty-like surface of the blasting gelatin. The paper wrapper began to curl and brown. A tiny curl of white smoke drifted from the explosive brick. The chemical reaction initiated. Eldridge brought his heavy leather boot down. He stomped the gray cord and the edge of the brick. He drove his heel into the floorboards with desperate, absolute violence. He ground the leather sole against the wood. He twisted his weight, grinding the spark into dust. He held his boot down. He squeezed his eyes shut. He braced for the concussive shockwave to tear him apart. The lobby remained silent, save for the howling wind and the crackling fire. The gelatin did not detonate. Eldridge lifted his boot. A scorched black smear marked the pine floorboards. The end of the gray fuse lay dead and crushed. The pale bricks hung inert on the iron hinges. He let out a long, ragged breath. He rested his forehead against the freezing timber of the baggage room door. The adrenaline drained from his blood, leaving behind a profound, bone-deep exhaustion. The cuts on his arm and ribs throbbed with a dull, heavy rhythm. He reached up. He grabbed the massive sliding iron bolt, securing the door. The metal felt like a block of ice. He pulled the heavy bolt backward. The iron scraped against the brackets. He pushed the oak door open. Absolute blackness stared back at him. The freezing air of the icebox rolled over his face. He smelled coal dust and wet canvas. "Dora!" Eldridge called into the dark. He heard the rustle of fabric. He heard the station master weeping in the corner. "I possess the key," a weak voice drifted from the pile of canvas sacks. Dora Reed spoke through chattering teeth. "I placed it inside my boot." Eldridge slumped against the doorframe. He looked back at the ruined lobby. Silas Miller lay broken on the floorboards. The fire in the freight office burned steady, illuminating the wreckage of the night. "Keep it in your boot," Eldridge told the darkness. "The board is clear." Chapter 19. The mountain wind died an hour before dawn. The silence hit Summit Station like a physical blow. The relentless, shrieking howl vanished, leaving behind a profound stillness that made the ears ring. The morning sun crested the jagged eastern peaks. Bright, pale light poured through the shattered windows and the blasted hole in the lobby wall. The rays illuminated the dust, settling over the ruined pine floorboards. Eldridge Sample sat on an overturned bench near the dead potbelly stove. He held a half-empty bottle of rye whiskey in his right hand. The station master kept the liquor stashed in a floor safe behind the ticket counter. Eldridge poured a generous splash of the amber liquid directly onto the deep slash across his left forearm. He bit down hard on his back teeth. He refused to make a sound. The alcohol burned the open flesh, searing the exposed muscle. He set the bottle down. He picked up a strip of clean white cotton, torn from a dead gunman's shirt. He wrapped the fabric tight around his arm, pulling the knot closed with his teeth and his right hand. He repeated the process for the long, shallow cut across his ribs. The cold air stung the raw skin. He bound his torso with another length of cotton. He pulled his torn canvas coat back over his shoulders. The heavy fabric felt stiff with frozen blood and melted snow. He stood up. His joints popped. The physical toll of the long night settled deep into his bones. He walked across the lobby. Silas Miller sat on the floorboards, his back pressed against a massive, load-bearing timber column. Thick copper telegraph wire bound the professor to the wood. Eldridge had salvaged the heavy wire from the ruined office upstairs. He wrapped the copper strands around Miller's chest, his arms and his ankles. He twisted the ends tight with a pair of iron pliers from the boiler room. Miller offered a horrific sight in the crisp morning light. The brass pommel of the Bowie knife had crushed the left side of his jaw. The skin stretched tight over shattered bone, turning a deep mottled purple. Dried blood caked his neat silver-streaked beard. The wire-rimmed spectacles sat cracked and crooked on his nose. The cultured, elegant thief resembled a beaten dog tied to a fence post. Miller glared up at Eldridge. He breathed through his nose. His chest heaved against the copper wire. He opened his mouth to speak. A string of bloody saliva dripped from his lips. A wet, broken rasp emerged from his throat. The sophisticated baritone voice existed no more. "Save your breath," Eldridge advised. He looked down at the ruined man. "The bones need time to knit. You try to form words, you drive the splinters deeper into your own gums." Miller squeezed his eyes shut. Defeat radiated from his slumped shoulders. The grand, precise transit ended in a tangle of scavenged wire. Eldridge turned away from the column. He walked to the baggage room door. The heavy iron bolt remained drawn back. The thick oak panel sat open. The station master, the cook, and the two brakemen occupied the lobby. They moved with slow, stiff steps. They picked their way through the shattered timber and the scattered debris. They avoided the unexploded bricks of blasting gelatin still clinging to the iron hinges. They avoided the bloodstains. The station master carried Dora Reed. He laid the wounded Pinkerton detective on a surviving wooden bench near the ticket counter. Dora possessed skin the color of old parchment. Her breath came in shallow, ragged hitches. The thick wool pad pressed against her shattered collarbone held a heavy crust of dried blood. The extreme cold of the icebox had saved her life, slowing the bleeding to a crawl, but the shock hovered close. Eldridge approached the bench. He pulled a thick buffalo hide coat from the floor. He had stripped the coat from one of Miller's dead men outside in the snowdrifts. He draped the heavy fur over Dora, tucking the edges around her shivering shoulders. Dora opened her eyes. The dark irises lacked focus for a moment. Then they locked onto Eldridge. "The fire stopped," Dora whispered. Her voice sounded thin, frail as dry grass. "The fire stopped," Eldridge confirmed. He uncorked the bottle of rye whiskey. He held the glass rim to her pale lips. "Drink a small amount. It warms the blood." She took a sip. She coughed, a weak sound that caused a spasm of pain across her ruined shoulder. She grimaced, settling her head back against the wood. "You broke his jaw," Dora murmured. She looked past Eldridge toward the timber column. She saw the bound professor. He required silencing. A deep, rhythmic vibration interrupted the quiet. Eldridge felt the tremor through the soles of his boots. The pine floorboards shuddered. A low bass thrum echoed off the granite peaks surrounding the pass. The sound grew louder. The rhythm increased. A heavy, mechanical grinding noise filled the mountain air. It sounded like a massive iron beast chewing through solid rock. A steam whistle shattered the morning. The blast tore through the valley. A towering, deafening shriek of released pressure. It bounced off the high ridges, announcing an arrival with absolute authority. "The plow," the station master gasped. He stumbled toward the blasted hole in the east wall. He stared out at the snow-covered tracks. They cleared the lower gorge. Eldridge stepped up to the jagged breach. He rested his right hand on the walnut grips of the peacemaker. He looked down the steel rails leading up from the western slope. A massive plume of thick black coal smoke stained the pristine blue sky. The rotary snowplow rounded the final bend. The machine presented a terrifying display of industrial power. A massive, circular steel fan dominated the front of the engine. The 10-foot blades spun with blinding speed. The heavy iron teeth bit into the towering snowdrifts blocking the tracks. The rotary blades chewed the packed ice. A geyser of pure white snow erupted high into the air, thrown 50 feet to the side of the tracks by the sheer force of the spinning steel. The ground shook. The immense steam engine pushed the plow forward, a relentless juggernaut conquering the frozen mountain. The train breached the final massive drift guarding the station approach. The spinning blades slowed. The engineer cut the steam to the rotary fan. The heavy iron wheels shrieked against the steel rails, throwing sparks as the brakemen applied the pressure. The massive locomotive ground to a halt alongside the wooden platform of Summit Station. Clouds of white steam hissed from the release valves. The heat melted the fresh snow on the platform planks. The smell of burning coal and hot grease washed over the ruined depot. 3 passenger cars and a heavy steel express car trailed behind the engine. The doors of the passenger cars swung open. Armed men poured out onto the platform. They wore thick blue woolen coats and flat-brimmed hats. They carried Winchester repeating rifles and double-barreled shotguns. Railroad guards and Pinkerton agents assigned to protect the federal payroll inside the express car. They stepped down from the iron stairs, expecting a routine stop. They expected a quiet, frozen station master and a cup of hot coffee. They found a war zone. The lead guard stopped in his tracks. He raised his Winchester. He stared at the bullet-riddled exterior of the depot. He saw the shattered windows. He saw the massive smoking hole blown straight through the log wall. He saw the bodies. Burke and Shaw lay frozen in the deep snowdrifts near the woodpile. The morning sun illuminated the blood soaked into the white powder. "Fan out," the lead guard roared. He pumped the lever of his rifle. A brass shell flew into the snow. "Secure the perimeter. Watch the tree line. Watch the roof." A dozen armed men scattered across the platform. They sought cover behind stacked cargo crates and the thick wooden pilings holding the roof overhang. They leveled their weapons at the dark, jagged hole in the station wall. Eldridge Sample stepped into the breach. He stood framed by the splintered pine logs. The morning sun hit his face. He kept his hands away from his gun belt. He let his arms hang loose by his sides. He presented a calm, stationary target. "Hold your fire," Eldridge called out. His voice carried across the hissing steam of the locomotive. The lead guard centered his rifle sights on Eldridge's chest. "Keep your hands in the open," the guard ordered. He stepped out from behind a wooden crate. He kept the Winchester locked tight to his shoulder. "Identify yourself. State your business." "I bought a ticket," Eldridge answered. "The train runs late." "We find dead men in the snow," the guard shouted. "We find a building blown to splinters. You stand in the middle of a slaughter." "The dead men brought the dynamite," Eldridge explained. He did not move. He let the guards assess the situation. He let them see the lack of threat in his posture. "They brought the shotguns. They intended to board your train. They intended to open your express car." The guard frowned. He lowered the barrel of his rifle an inch. He eyed the heavy canvas coat, the blood-stained bandages, and the low-slung gun belt. "You stopped them?" the guard asked. Doubt laced his tone. "I prefer a quiet waiting room," Eldridge said. They made noise. A commotion stirred inside the ruined lobby behind Eldridge. The station master and the cook appeared in the breach. They supported Dora Reed between them. The Pinkerton detective leaned heavily on the two men. She clutched the buffalo hide coat around her shoulders. She stepped into the sunlight. The lead guard saw the woman. He saw the horrific damage to her shoulder. Dora raised her left hand. She held a flat leather wallet. She flipped the leather open. A silver star caught the morning light. "Pinkerton National Detective Agency," Dora announced. Her voice lacked volume, but it carried absolute authority. "I hold the commission. I hold the brass key for the express car." The lead guard lowered his rifle completely. The other men on the platform followed suit, dropping their weapons and stepping out from behind cover. Recognition dawned on their faces. They recognized the badge. They recognized the undercover operative assigned to coordinate the transit. "Miss Reed," the lead guard said. He hurried forward, pulling off his flat-brimmed hat. "We received zero communication." The telegraph line sat dead. "The line suffered an intentional cut," Dora said. She nodded toward the dark interior of the lobby. "The orchestrator sits inside, tied to a wooden post. He requires iron cuffs and a federal judge." The guards rushed past Eldridge. They crowded through the blasted hole in the wall. They entered the station to secure the prisoner and assess the remaining damage. Eldridge stepped aside. He let the rush of armed men pass him by. He walked out onto the wooden platform. He felt the heat radiating from the massive iron boiler of the steam engine. The warmth felt spectacular against his freezing skin. He breathed in the smell of the coal smoke. The storm broke. The violent night concluded. The mountain surrendered the siege. Eldridge reached into his vest pocket. He pulled out his tin cup dented from the fight in the kitchen. He looked toward the passenger cars. He decided to find the dining car porter and demand a fresh pot of coffee. Chapter 20. The interior of the Pullman sleeper car smelled of carbolic acid, burning coal, and fresh linen. The railroad company maintained a pristine environment for their wealthy passengers. Dark mahogany panels lined the walls. Polished brass gas lamps hung from the curved ceiling. Thick green velvet covered the plush seats. The opulence presented a jarring contrast to the blood-soaked pine floorboards of Summit Station. Eldridge Sample sat on a velvet bench. He held a ceramic mug in his right hand. The mug contained actual coffee, brewed fresh in the dining car. The dark liquid tasted like roasted beans, lacking the bitter, scorched chicory bite of the station master's brew. He watched the company doctor work. Dr. Miller wore a starched white shirt and a canvas apron. He possessed a neat row of silver surgical instruments laid out on a folded towel. He stood over a lowered sleeping berth. Dora Reed lay on the mattress. A thick white bandage covered her right shoulder. The doctor finished tying off a black silk suture. He snipped the trailing thread with a pair of silver scissors. He wiped his hands on a clean rag. "The bullet shattered the clavicle," Dr. Miller said. He dropped the scissors onto the towel. "The cold saved your life. It constricted the blood vessels. You require rest. You require a sling for 6 weeks. The bone needs time to knit together." "I require a telegraph station," Dora countered. Her voice lacked its usual force, but the core iron remained. "I need to file a report to the Chicago office. I need to document the recovery of the federal payroll." "You file reports from a hospital bed in Denver," the doctor ordered. He snapped his black leather bag shut. "The company pays my wage to keep people breathing. I suggest you close your eyes." Dr. Miller stepped out of the sleeper car. He moved down the narrow corridor to tend to the bruised station master. Eldridge took a sip of the coffee. He set the ceramic mug on a small wooden table. He rolled his left sleeve down over the fresh white bandage wrapped around his forearm. The doctor had cleaned the rapier cut with raw iodine. The antiseptic burn still throbbed in his flesh. Dora shifted on the mattress. She pulled a clean wool blanket up to her chin with her uninjured left hand. She looked across the narrow aisle. "Miller resides in the baggage car," Dora said. "The guards chained him to a steel support beam," Eldridge confirmed. "He offers 0 resistance. The broken jaw curtails his conversation. He spends the ride down the mountain swallowing blood. He faces a federal judge. He faces a long drop from a short rope. He chose the game," Eldridge said. "He accepts the prize." Dora studied the drifter. She catalogued the torn canvas coat resting on the bench beside him. She noted the bruised knuckles, the cut on his chin, the exhaustion etched deep into the lines of his face. She recognized the specific brand of competence he displayed throughout the long, brutal night. "You cleared a room of 7 armed men," Dora stated. "They locked themselves inside a box," Eldridge said. "They allowed the environment to dictate their movements. They broke their own communication lines. I utilized the tools they discarded. You minimize the accomplishment. I state the facts." Dora pushed herself up. She ignored the wince of pain crossing her features. She propped her back against the mahogany wall of the train car. "Alan Pinkerton recruits men with your particular set of skills," Dora said. Eldridge leaned back against the velvet seat. He crossed his boots. He listened. "The agency requires field operatives," Dora continued. "Men capable of handling violent situations without succumbing to panic. We protect railroad assets. We track fugitives across state lines. We provide security for banks and express companies." "You hunt men for a wage," Eldridge said. We enforce the law where local sheriffs lack the jurisdiction or the courage, Dora corrected. The agency provides a badge. It provides a steady salary. It provides travel expenses and an expense account for ammunition. You stop sleeping in freezing stables. You stop drinking bitter coffee. You become a professional. I am a professional. You are a drifter, Dora said. She kept her gaze steady, refusing to back down. You ride a half-starved horse into a blizzard. You carry a single revolver. You rely on luck and raw instinct. The luck runs out eventually. The instinct dulls with age. The Pinkerton National Detective Agency offers structure. We offer a future. Eldridge picked up his coffee mug. He stared into the black liquid. He pictured the structure she offered. A desk in a brick building in Chicago. A supervisor handing him a paper file. A uniform standard. Rules of engagement drafted by men wearing tailored suits and silk ties. He pictured the heavy silver star pinned to his chest. A shining target, drawing the eye of every desperate gunman in the territory. A badge acts like a leash, Eldridge said. A badge provides authority. Authority requires permission, Eldridge countered. You step into a saloon wearing a silver star. You announce your intentions to the entire room. You draw a line in the sawdust. The men on the other side of the line start shooting. You operate under a set of constraints. I prefer to operate without boundaries. Dora sighed. The exertion drained the color from her face. You prefer the shadows, she said. I prefer my own schedule, Eldridge corrected. I ride where I choose. I stop when I choose. I fight the battles I decide to fight. I lack the temperament to take orders from a man sitting behind a mahogany desk thousands of miles away. The offer stands, Dora said. She reached into her pocket with her good hand. She pulled out a small embossed card. She tossed it across the aisle. It landed on the velvet cushion next to Eldridge. You reach Denver, you find the local field office. You present that card. They provide the paperwork. Eldridge looked at the crisp white card. The iconic unblinking eye logo stared back at him. We never sleep. I plan to sleep for 3 days, Eldridge said. He left the card on the velvet bench. He stood up. He grabbed his ruined canvas coat. He draped the torn fabric over his shoulder. He touched the brim of his hat. Keep the shoulder clean, Eldridge told her. Gunshot wounds invite fever. Watch your back, Mr. Sample, Dora replied. The mountain holds a long memory. Eldridge turned away. He walked out of the sleeper car. He navigated the vestibule, connecting the train cars. The iron coupling clanked beneath his boots. He stepped into the next car. He searched for a specific man. He found him standing near the luggage racks. A brakeman wearing a thick wool sweater. The same man Hollis struck with a rifle butt hours ago. A massive purple bruise covered the side of the brakeman's face. Eldridge reached into his vest pocket. He pulled out a single silver dollar. He held the coin out. I left a bay horse in the station stable, Eldridge said. The animal requires transport. Load him into the livestock car before this train departs. The brakeman looked at the silver dollar. He looked at the drifter who had dismantled Silas Miller's crew. He took the coin. I secure the animal, the brakeman promised. I provide fresh oats and water. Eldridge continued his walk down the train corridor. He moved past the dining car. He inhaled the scent of frying bacon and fresh biscuits. His stomach rumbled, a harsh reminder of his empty fuel reserves. He ignored the hunger. He required a different transaction first. He located the train conductor. The man wore a crisp blue uniform, adorned with gleaming brass buttons. He held a silver ticket punch in his right hand. He inspected a clipboard full of manifests. Eldridge approached the conductor. "I require passage to Denver," Eldridge stated. The conductor looked up. He recognized the man. The lead guard had briefed the train crew on the events inside the depot. "The railroad company offers you a complimentary seat, sir," the conductor said. He gestured toward the passenger cars. "Your actions preserve the express car vault. Management insists we cover your fare." "I pay my own debts," Eldridge said. He reached into his pocket. He extracted $3 silver. The heavy coins clinked together in his palm. He held the money out to the man in the blue uniform. "First class," Eldridge specified. "A forward-facing seat. I want a window looking down the mountain. I want a location near the coal stove." The conductor hesitated. He looked at the silver. He looked at the hard and compromising set of Eldridge's jaw. The conductor understood the pride of a solitary man. He accepted the coins. He slipped them into his leather pouch. He unclipped a heavy paper ticket from his board. He punched a specific pattern into the edge with the silver tool. He handed the ticket to Eldridge. "Car number 3, the conductor directed. "Seat 4A. The porter brings fresh blankets every hour." Eldridge took the ticket. He walked to car number 3. He found the designated seat. The velvet cushion felt thick and luxurious. A brass heater radiated intense, continuous warmth near his boots. The large glass window provided a clear view of the mountain pass. He tossed his ruined canvas coat onto the empty seat beside him. He sank into the velvet. He stretched his long legs out. The physical relief washed over his battered muscles in a heavy, rolling wave. Outside, a deep blast from the steam whistle announced the departure. The massive iron wheels ground against the steel rails. The locomotives surged forward. The train pulled away from the wooden platform of Summit Station. The bullet-riddled depot, the shattered windows, and the frozen bloodstains faded into the white landscape, swallowed by the distance. Eldridge rested his head against the glass. He watched the rugged, snow-covered pine trees blur past the window. The rhythmic clack-clack of the wheels on the tracks provided a soothing, mechanical lullaby. He closed his eyes. He stopped thinking about Silas Miller. He stopped thinking about the Pinkerton detective. He let his mind drift down the mountain, focusing on a single clear image waiting for him in the valley below. A porcelain tub. Steaming hot water. A bar of clean soap. The end.